The Mystery of Dr. Johnson's Death, a Spiritual Scandal in the Punjab. Written by David Christopher Lane. Narrated by J. Keith Jackson. The Mystery of Dr. Johnson's Death. Dr. Julian P. Johnson died in 1939, shortly before his famous book, The Path of the Masters, was first published in a limited edition in Paris, France. Footnote: the first edition is now a very rare item, since only a limited number were printed in a beautifully bound volume with fine Bible paper back in 1939 under the supervision of Dr. Pierre Schmidt. I fondly remember a long meeting in 1988 I had with the late Sawan Singh, one of the successors to Paul Singh, the founder of Rouhani Satsang, at his ashram in Vijayanagar, Old Delhi. We discussed minute details of Sant Mat history, and at one point in our conversation, Sawan Singh very proudly pulled out a first edition copy he possessed of Julian Johnson's The Path of the Masters and showed it to me. Later I learned that the University of California, Berkeley owned one of the original copies, and I made a photocopy of it for posterity. End footnote. How he died, however, has been shrouded in mystery for decades. Rumors have persisted for years that he was murdered by a young man named Paul. Whereas other stories circulated amongst Beas Satsangis that he accidentally fell and hit his head on a set of bricks. Still others, outside of Radhaswami circles, suggested that unknown, darker, occult forces killed him. Thankfully, due to the diligent research of Joseph O'Leary, the true, even if still muddled, story of Dr. Julian P. Johnson's death was uncovered. This small book is a detailed description and explanation of what happened on that fateful night on January 25th, 1939. Footnote: The Dawn of Light, 1985, which provides a detailed history about the origin and growth of Radhaswami in America, puts Johnson's death on January 21st, 1939, some 4 days before its actual occurrence. There are several variations on the spelling and spacing of Radhaswami, in English ranging from Radhaswami, R-A-D-H-A space S-O-A-M-I, to Radhaswami, S-W-A-M-I. The Agra Satsangs spell the word with no spacing, whereas Beas uses a space between Radha and Swami. See the Radhaswami Tradition, New York and London, Garland Publishers, 1992, for more about why spelling and spacing matters to the Swami Bhag Satsang. End footnote. It is a complicated story since all the eyewitnesses are now deceased, and we have to rely on a scarcity of documentation and questionable memoirs written years after the tragedy. Julian Philip Johnson. It is highly probable that the American doctor from Kentucky, Julian Philip Johnson, 1873 to 1939, would have remained relatively unknown were it not for his 4 published books describing the Radhaswami path of Beas, including With a Great Master in India, Call of the East, The Unquenchable Flame, and his most famous text, The Path of the Masters, all published in the 1930s. Footnote: there is also one unpublished manuscript by Julian Johnson entitled More Light on the Path of the Masters. Since it was never finished, Beas has never published it. However, Chris Rudd in England once gave me a photocopy of the text. In reading it, I realized that Johnson was attempting to give an almost literal interpretation to Shiv Dayal Singh's famous poem, Hidayatnama, in the book Sar Bachan Poetry. I was subsequently asked by the Radhaswami Satsang at Beas to return my copy as they did not want it circulated. I acceded to their request. End footnote. These books, particularly his last one, have been widely circulated and read around the world by a variety of spiritual seekers interested in Sant Mat mysticism. Johnson wrote each of them while living in Beas, Punjab, India, which was the central headquarters of his guru Sawan Singh, also honorifically called the Great Master or Huzur Maharaj. Although Johnson had visited India decades prior as a Baptist minister bent on preaching Christianity to the heathen masses, he later changed his views and became interested in theosophy, yoga, and alternative philosophies. In the introductory section of With a Great Master in India, 1934, Johnson provides a thumbnail sketch of his life. I was brought up in a most orthodox environment. When I was a boy, the sermons in the Baptist church where I attended fairly smelled of brimstone, and anyone who was not converted and baptized by immersion was pretty sure of immersion in that lake that burned with unquenchable fire. But there were many questions I wanted to ask, only those questions were generally settled by the indignant assertion that the old devil was putting doubts into my mind. As a boy, I was reading and explaining the Bible to everyone. There was no mystery about it. Only I found out later that some of my explanations were not to be tolerated. These were quite unorthodox, and everything unorthodox was of the devil. The book of Revelation was one of my favorites. I knew all about it, even though many of the world's greatest scholars never claimed so much. However, only a few days ago, I picked up the New Testament and read that portion again, to see if my later studies had thrown any light upon it. I found, somewhat to my amazement, that now I had not the slightest idea of its meaning. I wonder if the writer himself had any clear conception of it. At the age of 17, I was licensed to preach and spent the next 17 years trying to convince the world that the Baptist Church was the divinely commissioned organ of the Almighty for the enlightenment and salvation of mankind. At 22, I was graduated from college at Bolivar, Missouri, from which school I obtained 3 degrees, and was then appointed a missionary to India. That ancient land always held a peculiar fascination for me. As a boy, even the map of India held me spellbound. Now, I was sorry for India, and would go out and set her right in matters of religion. I was not then aware of the fact that the great men of India were adepts in religion and spiritual science ages before my own country was discovered by civilized man, even when my ancestors were pirates along the northern coasts of Europe. But I was young, optimistic, and egoistic. Nothing daunted, I set out to convert the world. But after near 3 years in India, I returned to America with my orthodox egotism a bit deflated. I was like an automobile tire with a small puncture, a little flat but still going. I had met a few men in India, although they were not masters, who knew so much more about everything than I did that I was mystified, amazed. Amazed not so much at my own ignorance as at their massive learning. I had come to India to convert ignorant heathen, but by the side of some of them, I was still in the primer class. I had my 3 diplomas tucked away in the trunk, and I never showed them to anybody after that. I had gone out to convert the heathen, and the heathen had set me to thinking, even if they had not converted me. I was born with an irrepressible desire for knowledge. At least it was very early manifest. My mother used to call me the standing interrogation point. I just must know the ins and outs of things, the whys and the wherefores. I never could accept complacently what was dished out to me and ask no questions. And this trait of character has often got me into trouble. It has always been quite impossible for me to fit myself into a nice little stall someplace and eat my hay along with the rest. First, I wanted to analyze a sample of the hay, and that a good horse is not supposed to do. I never could take gracefully to the harness while some archbishop sat up in the chariot behind me with his whip in hand. Determined to get my feet on solid ground, if possible, in matters of mind and soul, I entered school again, this time in the great University of Chicago. There I spent 5 years in an intensive search for reality, graduating in 2 different departments, one of which was theology. But my graduating thesis was a disappointment to my dear Orthodox professors. I took the position that the real source and inspiration of the Renaissance and of the Protestant Reformation in Europe was the great principle of individual liberty, reborn and now asserting itself in spite of all church dogmas, both Catholic and Protestant. The fact that a few great Protestant leaders, themselves only half liberated from the tyranny of dogma, took a leading part in the general awakening, by no means obliged us to ascribe to their teachings the real source of the Renaissance. They themselves were the unconscious agents of a greater and deeper principle, of a far more gigantic force, which was now moving all Europe and the world. But my beloved professors were deeply aggrieved that I did not attribute the Great Awakening to the dogmas of the Baptist Church. Their labor of love had been wasted upon me. I was hopelessly led astray by German rationalism. Much was the pity. But as for myself, I was in a worse predicament than a man on the highway with a flat tire. I did not even have a highway. I was utterly in the woods. I had a roll of diplomas, but they were of no use to me. They meant nothing. Except one thing, and that is, after all, a thing of supreme value. They represented a real mental awakening. If a man once awakens from his age-long stupor and learns to think, actually begins to think independently, he has accomplished much. Until that time arrives, it can never be said of him that he is an educated man, no matter how many diplomas he may have won or how loudly the world may acclaim his learning. Being now without a profession that I could sincerely follow, I turned to the study of medicine. That, at least, was something definite with which I could occupy hands and brain. I won my medical degree from the State University of Iowa and settled on the Pacific Coast to practice. But in all the years that followed, my interest in spiritual things never slackened. It rather grew more intense. I must have been born under that star. I sought eternally for the real, for the true. But now I no longer sought for it in organized religion. I no longer expected to find it in the great schools of learning. So I became interested in New Thought, in Christian Science, in spiritualism. But none of these seemed to get at the root of the matter. I found in Theosophy a greater appeal than in any of the rest. It held a keen interest. It surely had glimmerings of the light, but much of it seemed so far away and intangible. Its great teachers wrote learnedly and pointed to masters far away in the depths of the Himalayas, where the great white brotherhood controlled the destinies of men. But when I tried to get in touch with some of these great ones, the path of approach always vanished. I took up the study of Rosicrucianism. That also was good. It seemed to point in the right direction. It was deeply fascinating. But in it, I could never find the way to the feet of any man who could speak with authority on any of the deeper problems. If they had masters, they were to me quite inaccessible, and I was put off with many vague promises. I continued to flounder about in deep waters. I never seemed quite able to get my feet on a firm foundation. Finally, during a long course of reading, and especially during the study of Oriental philosophy, of the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, etc., the idea of the master gradually took shape in my consciousness. There was the ideal, standing out among all creeds and systems, yet above them all was the living master. He represented the highest and the best in actual life, for he has himself actually achieved in his own person the highest ideals of all religions, and by virtue of that achievement he, and he alone, could speak with authority on the subject. And the most appealing thing about the master was the idea that by following him, any man might achieve the same results and himself become a master. No one has any monopoly on spiritual attainments. The idea of the master appealed to both reason and intuition. I was quite sure that if there was no such thing as real masters, there ought to be. There must be masters. I became more and more convinced that if I could not find the solution of all my problems in a living master, then that solution could not be found on earth. Further search would be useless, for I had now explored about everything else that offered any rational promise of light. So I began my search for a master. I wrote to everybody in the world that I had any idea had ever seen one. Most of them did not reply, and this list included many Indians who at that time were posing as masters in America and collecting ready cash for a prescription purporting to make their students into masters, for so much per head. Those who did reply generally put me off with some vague and indefinite statement. One man who claimed to have spent years as the masters in India replied, "When you become master of yourself, you are in the presence of the masters." But to one crying in the wilderness, there is not much comfort in that. Once or twice I thought I had found a master, but on closer scrutiny and more critical study, I had to give up and begin my search all over again. But each time, I renewed the search with more zeal than ever. In spite of many counterfeits, the real master must be found somewhere. Every good thing in the world is imitated and capitalized by designing men, And the better a thing is, the more cleverly it is counterfeited. I was now convinced beyond a question that real masters did exist somewhere on Earth. Knowing that India has been the reputed home of the masters for ages, I would have set out for India at once, but after arrival in India, I would have had no way of locating the master. I had heard of different men who had gone to India in search of a master and returned disappointed. I believed then, and have since found out for a certainty, that there are millions of people in India who have no knowledge of a real master, perhaps many who have never heard of one. And I now know of scores of people who live less than 3 miles from the greatest master in India, and yet they have not the least idea of a master. They have seen him pass through their village time and again. They have heard him spoken of as a holy man, and yet they have no idea of his mastership. They pass him by as just one more of the thousands of sadhus, who are more or less revered as men who possess certain unusual knowledge and powers, but most of whom are little more than dirty beggars, going about collecting an easy living. The people have been so imposed upon that most of them pay but slight attention when a real master does appear. But my search was a long-distance one, and I just had to go on waiting and searching for a clue. In the meantime, I had spent nearly 3 years as assistant surgeon in the United States Navy, during and after the Great War. Later, I settled in California and resumed private practice. I built a hospital of my own and developed a considerable surgical practice. Years passed, and a heavy practice wore on me to some extent, but my interest in the eternal quest never abated. I became entangled in world affairs. I made much money, invested it, and lost it. Complications involving business and domestic difficulties wove about me an intolerable situation. All the while, that inner urge for the eternal realities became more and more dominant and insistent. I became more and more disgusted with the world and its false glamours. It seemed to me that the whole world was rushing on, madly indulging itself, and then when it got the bellyache, it came to me for a pill or an operation. I was sick of it all. So one day, I rented out my hospital, filled up my gas tank, and, all alone, I headed for the South on a vacation. I didn't even tell my most intimate friends where I was going. In fact, I didn't know myself. But I knew I had to have a change and a rest. And a few days later, I drove into a grove of eucalyptus trees in Brawley, the Imperial Valley. It was then, during the winter of 1928 to 29, while visiting in the Imperial Valley, California, that the darkest hour of my life came upon me. It seemed as if I had come to the end of all roads, the end of the trail. Ahead there was nothing but the desert, the darkness and the end. Nothing but blank darkness. Bitterness of soul and despair settled upon me. I was ready to hate the whole world for leading me on in a series of constant disappointments. But finally, realizing that would only make bad matters worse, I at last resorted to humble prayer to that Supreme Father in whom I had always believed, but who, it seemed to me, had sadly neglected one of his boys. Self-pity and blaming others is such an easy way of sliding out of one's own shortcomings. Whether my prayers were heard and answered by some gracious divine agency, or whether my attitude of prayer simply brought me into harmony with the divine law, does not matter. The end results are the same. I awoke one morning with the keen realization of having been literally floating in an ocean of love. It seemed to me an actual experience, floating in an ocean of love. I could think of nothing else all day that day. The aspect of the whole world had changed overnight, and the following morning I had the same delightful sensation. It was evident that some vital and transforming change had taken place in me. I looked upon the world with new eyes. I loved everything that lived, and most gratefully I bowed my soul before the Supreme Father. A few days later, the impression came to me like the strokes of a hammer upon my brain that I must go north. So, without further hesitation, I just put a notice on my door: too hot, gone north. In fact, the weather was getting pretty warm by that time. I drove over to Pasadena and Los Angeles, and then up the scenic coast route. Returning by the inland Pacific Highway, I stopped in Ashland, Oregon, to visit an old lady. Julia R. McQuilkin, whom I had known and loved for 25 years. She was then nearing her 80th milestone in life's journey, but her brain was active and her soul radiant. She had lived a long life of useful deeds. Almost the first thing I noticed on entering her sitting room, lying there on her library table, was a copy of Radhaswami Matprakash. Footnote: Radhaswami Matprakash, usually spelled with no space between the A and the O, was written by Rai Saligram, Huzur Maharaj, the second guru in the Radhaswami lineage at Pipal Mandi, Agra. It was published in 1898. Salig Ram, sometimes spelled Saligram, without a space between the words Salig and Ram, was instrumental in making his guru's life and teachings more widely known. The distinguished Indian scholar and philologist Max Muller includes a chapter in Salig Ram in his 1899 book, The Life and Sayings of Ramakrishna. End footnote. It struck me peculiarly. I began to read, and one of the first paragraphs my eyes fell upon read, "The Supreme Being is a boundless ocean of spirit, or love, and the human being a drop or current of spirit or love from this ocean. And love, being the very essence and means of existence of the whole creation, it follows that no effort in any direction, temporal or spiritual, unless actuated by love or affectionate regard, can be crowned with success, and the work or labor rendered easy, sweet, and harmonious." Strangely enough, here was my ocean of love in which I had been baptized, and in the very same paragraph, a complete and perfect explanation as to why I had failed in so many of my undertakings. It came with the force of a personal message from the skies. I continued to read. When lunch was ready, I fed myself with one hand, while I held on to the book with the other. I asked questions. Finally, when the little volume had been read through the second time, I asked my friend where she had obtained it. In all philosophical and occult literature, there was nothing like it. It carried a different message. My beloved hostess smiled and said that it was an exposition of the teachings of a master in India. I eagerly inquired what master. She then told me that for 7 years she had been an initiate of this master, and if I wished, she would give me directions as to how I might get in touch with him myself. If I wished. Would I wish to drink water if I was dying of thirst? At last I was to find a master. I asked her why she had not told me of her master before, when she knew well that I had long been in search of one. She smiled again and said, "You were not ready before." Ah, that was it. I was not ready. Even though I had longed to see the master, I was not yet ready to stand in his holy presence. That was why my guru had not appeared. We are so prone to think of everything else except our own unworthiness. But at last, thanks to that ocean of love and my good friend, I was to find a master. About 8 months from that date, I received instructions from the master himself to proceed to Port Angeles, Washington for my initiation. I could never convey to another person any adequate idea of the deep gratitude which I felt when this message came. A little over a year from the date of my initiation, one fine day, I laid down my surgical instruments, locked the doors of my hospital, and slept soundly that night. The next morning, I drove down to San Francisco to take a steamer for India. On the 24th day of March, 1932, I sailed out through the Golden Gate, headed for Honolulu and the Far East. Sawan Singh. The master that changed Julian Johnson's life was Sawan Singh, 1858 to 1948, of Radhaswami Satsang Beas, who was the successor to Jaimal Singh, who himself was an initiate of Shivdayal Singh, the founder of Radhaswami in Agra, Uttar Pradesh, in the mid-19th century. Sawan Singh served as a military engineer after graduating from Thomason College, Roorkee. Brought up as Sikh, Sawan was deeply interested in spirituality and eventually got initiated in Surat Shabad Yoga by Jaimal Singh, who was visiting the Murray Hills when Sawan Singh was then stationed. He became very close to his guru, who groomed him as his spiritual successor at Beas, the place Jaimal Singh had settled after his retirement from the military. Although Jaimal Singh died in 1903, it was not until 1911 when Sawan Singh retired from military service that he was able to serve full-time as a guru. In that same year, one of Sawan Singh's initiates, Keir Singh Sasmas, sometimes spelled K-E-H-A-R instead of K-E-H-R, and S-A-S-M-U-S instead of S-A-S-M-A-S, came into contact with Dr. H.M. Brock, a dentist, and his wife, and they were eventually initiated into the Radhaswami path via proxy in Portland, Oregon. Footnote: there is an interesting, even if obscure, controversy about exactly how the Broks met with Kara Singh Sasmas. Dr. Andrea Diem, in her book The Guru in America, The Influence of Radhaswami on New Religions, unravels it. Beas books have long told the story that while Kara Singh was walking along a street in Port Angeles, Washington, he was approached by a couple, Dr. and Mrs. Brok. They had seen, floating above his head, a beautiful radiant face with a white turban and white beard. Startled by this remark, Kira responded, "It is my master, Maharaj Sawan Singh Ji." The problem with this story, however, is that it is not true. According to Kira Singh's own autobiography on the subject, he first met the Broks at a socialist party. It was actually another gentleman, Mr. C. Charles, who had the visionary experience of seeing Sawan Singh hover over Kara Singh not during an accidental encounter on the street, but on a boat. Essentially, the two stories have been conflated into one. This should serve as a cautionary tale since remembered history, when repeated often enough, takes on the illusory aura of being considered factual when, on closer inspection, it is not. End footnote. Later they served as Sawan Singh's representatives. 2 decades later, Julian Johnson assumed Dr. Brok's position. But as Dr. Andrea Diem explains, Johnson's work as representative was short-lived because he departed to India on March 24, 1932, just 6 months after being appointed, and just over 1 year after receiving initiation himself. In a letter to an American disciple, later published in the book Spiritual Gems, Sawan Singh explains how he came to the Radhaswami path. Satmat was spread in the Punjab by Guru Nanak Sahib and subsequently by Maharaj Baba Jaimal Singh Ji. Every single line of the Granth Sahib insists upon going in and contacting Nam, but you will find very few Mahatmas even who really go in. Although I was born in a Sikh family and at the age of 10 read Guru Granth Sahib and afterwards was intimately associated with Sikh religious preachers, yet whenever I read Gurbani, Granth Sahib, it struck a strange note in my heart. When I put searching questions to preachers, none could give me a satisfactory explanation. Gurmat, Santmat, is above all religions. For a long time, I associated with Baba Kahan. He usually remained in an ecstatic condition, which he developed after 14 years of persistent and vigorous practice. I associated with him for several months, and during that time, he showed supernatural powers on several occasions. When I asked him if he would shower grace upon me by initiating me, he answered, "No, he is somebody else. I do not have your share." I then asked him to tell me who that person was so that I could contact him. He replied, "When the time comes, he will himself find you." When I was SDO at Murray Hills and in charge of water supply works, my house was near a dharamsala, a free rest house where sadhus, mahatmas, and others going on the way to the pilgrimage of Amarnath in Kashmir would often stay, and I had the opportunity of talking to them and discussing religious and spiritual problems with them. In those days Babaji came to Murray and put up in the Gurdwara, a Sikh temple. He held satsang from Granth Sahib and created quite a stir by his novel, or what seemed to be novel, interpretation of Granth Sahib. This was brought to my notice too. One man said that he offers as prashad what is left in the plate after eating. Another told me that he puts musical instruments in the heads of people. I promptly pulled him up and said, "I am an engineer, and I know it is not possible to put any musical instrument in the head of a person." On the 4th day, I went to attend satsang. Babaji was at that time explaining the meaning of Japji Sahib. Well, I started my volley of questions. So much so that the audience got tired and began to feel restless. The sacred book, Sarbachan, was lying there and I objected to the name of Radhaswami. And Babaji explained from the book itself what Radhaswami meant. Radha ad Sarat ka naam, Swami ad Shabad Nijda. Translated, Radha is the name for the first or primal soul. Swami means the original Shabad of the real home. Now he wanted to point out the way, but I had read Vedanta. When I read Gurbani, my opinion was different. When I read Gita, my opinion was again different, etc. And I was unable to come to a decision. At last I applied for 8 days' leave to enable me to study the teachings of Babaji. He advised me to read Kabir Sahib's Anurag Sagar. I immediately ordered 8 copies of this book from Bombay so that I could also give some to my friends, Babu Hari Ram, Gulab Singh, and others, to read and comment on it. After several conferences with Babaji, I was thoroughly convinced and received initiation from him on the 15th day of October, 1894. Footnote. Sawan Singh served as a guru for nearly 45 years and initiated over 125,000 followers into the path of Radhaswami, a remarkable number at the time. Another disciple of Jaimal Singh also served as a guru. His name was Bhagat Singh, and he founded his center at Tarn Taran in the Punjab. Sawan Singh and Bhagat Singh got along well, and it was Sawan Singh who formally installed Bhagat Singh's successor, Deva Singh, at Tarn Taran in the mid-1940s. End footnote. Elizabeth Bruce. On December 3, 1930, Elizabeth Bruce arrived at Dialbog on the outskirts of Agra city in Uttar Pradesh, India. According to court records, she was born on April 19, 1894, and thus was in her mid-30s. Unmarried at the time, and having lived a life full of drama and unrest, she had come to serve under her new guru, Anand Swarup, Sabji Maharaj, who was the fifth guru in a lineage dating back from Kamadapi Sinha to Brahm Shankar Mishra to Rai Saligram to Shiv Dayal Singh, the acknowledged founder of Radhaswami. There are many factions in Radhaswami, each with their presiding guru. But in the 1930s, Dialbog was one of the largest satsangs and was well known for its model industries that had been widely publicized throughout North India. Anand Swarup also became known in the West when Paul Brunton wrote about him and Dialbog in the chapter The Garden of the Lord in his popular 1934 book, A Search in Secret India. When Brunton asked how many followers there were at the time, the leader responded, "Our membership is over 110,000, but, of course, only a few thousands have settled here. The Radhaswami fraternity is nearly 70 years old, but its greatest growth has been made during the last 20 years. And this progress has occurred, mind you, without any public propaganda because we are a semi-secret organization. If we cared to come out into the public eye and propagate our teachings openly, we could increase our membership tenfold. Our members are spread all over India already, but they look to Dialbog as their headquarters and visit us as often as they can. They are organized into local groups, which meet every Sunday at precisely the same hour when we hold a special meeting at Dialbog." Elizabeth Bruce is mentioned several times in her then-guru's diaries, which were later published in 3 volumes. Anand Swarup seems to have been highly pleased with her diligence and her ability to adapt so readily to Indian ways. Writes the guru in his December 2nd to December 5th, 1930 diary entry, "When Miss Bruce met me, she began to weep bitterly and said that so many years of her life had been wasted. I explained to her that it was not right to think so. The person who receives Lord's grace does not waste a single minute of his life. It is not impossible that past years of her life might have been spent in developing adhikara within her to enable her to come to the satsang. Miss Bruce said that she was prepared to abide by all the restrictions and rules of abstinence and put up with all troubles. She, however, wanted 2 things, viz. First, that her hope of spiritual progress should be fulfilled, and secondly, that the remaining part of her life might be spent in the service of the satsang. When I inquired about her food habits, Miss Bruce told me that she had practiced taking Indian food before coming here. Within 2 days, Miss Bruce has adopted satsang ways, i.e., she squats on the ground in the satsang, takes Indian food, and talks with all the apparent cordiality like Indians. She said that she felt that she had come to her home, and she wondered why she had been kept away so long in America. She said that she did not feel any difficulty in giving up meat, eggs, etc., and that she was eager to serve the satsang." It is apparent from Anand Swarup's repeated citations of Elizabeth Bruce that there was a certain pride in having an American woman in their fold, particularly given her devotion and diligence. She stayed at the Dialbog satsang for several years. However, something transpired during her stay that led to her discontentment. Interestingly, and perhaps fortuitously, she met with her American counterpart, Julian Johnson, when he met her during a trip to Agra with his guru. As Johnson briefly retells it in a letter he wrote back to America on October 13, 1932, "At Dialbog, Agra, this disciple had the pleasure of meeting Mrs. Elizabeth Bruce, an American satsangi who, so far as he knows, is the only other American in India devoted to this science. She's a very clever and brilliant woman, making herself useful in some phases of the industrial work of the center, while she seeks light on the inner path. This disciple took lunch with her twice and enjoyed some hours of pleasant conversation. It requires no little courage for an American woman to leave all of her friends and a successful business in the homeland and come out to India to devote herself to a spiritual science quite strange to all her people. But Mrs. Bruce appears to be very happy in the pursuit of her spiritual ideals in Dialbog, and we wish her all success." In just a few years' time, and no doubt to much controversy at Dialbog, Elizabeth switched allegiance to the Beas guru Sawan Singh and was married to Dr. Julian Johnson on July 10, 1934, in an Indian religious ceremony. Elizabeth Bruce was known as an herbalist and also created a line of face creams and cosmetics made from Indian herbs. She also helped assist Dr. Johnson as a nurse. In the book The Unquenchable Flame, which is a pseudo-autobiography since it was written by her newly married husband Julian Johnson, Elizabeth Bruce explains why she left Dialbog.
I was much like an old miner in the icy mountains of Alaska. He had staked everything on his one claim, but at the end of 3 years of painful digging, he laid down his tools. His feet wore bare and bleeding, and his hands numb with cold. His heart almost as numb as his hands. All hope now gone, he wrapped his ragged blanket about him and lay down, while the long dark night closed in about him. Now it seemed to me there was no hope, nothing left for me. I could go back to America and make money. Yes, but I had left all of that to come to India in search of a master and spiritual light. Work had increased, and I was doing service for the satsang. But still I was getting nowhere spiritually, the one thing for which I had left country, friends, money, and comforts to come to India. The realization that now 2 years had passed, and I had gained nothing spiritually gave me a painful start. What was the trouble? I hadn't gone there just to work for the satsang, but that was all I had accomplished. In addition to all of that, I was beginning to feel the strain of much hard work, and my health was rapidly failing. I took sick finally, and for several days I lay between life and death. Now the 3rd year was passing, and still I was getting nowhere. Yet my troubles had multiplied. When I put this matter point blank up to the guru, he said it was due to my karma. I had much within myself to overcome. My heart was bleeding, and I was terribly dejected. In this mood, and in my broken state of health, I finally left Agra, the place to which I had come with such high hopes and such joy. This was the most terrible disappointment of my whole life. But that has all vanished. I cannot complain any more. The dark cloud has been lifted, and the sun now shines bright and clear. I have found the true master, the real saint, and my bleeding heart has been healed. I met the great master at last. His holy light has healed every illness of my mind, and my body has grown strong again. The evidences of his mastership have accumulated in my consciousness. Until now there is no longer any possibility of doubt. Today I walk in his light. In me shines not the perfect light, indeed, but sufficient light to make the path radiant and certain. I know that my master is the perfect Sat Guru, my Lord and my liberator. The light grows in splendor all the day long. He is the embodiment of the Supreme Father, now bending down in grace to meet the needs of his little children. He took my hand in the hour of my despair, and today he still leads me. Where my Lord is, there can be no more night, no more pain. Never again shall my bleeding feet stumble over the thorny paths of uncertainty. I have found the assurance of certain knowledge. I have found the master I so long sought, and he is hero on the banks of a slow-rolling river in the Punjab, India. Today, how I wish I could take the hands of all my friends in America and elsewhere and say to them, "Come see him for yourself." I cannot tell you how great he is. His light blinds me. Its glory silences all my powers of speech. His divine love is my breath, my life. But the heavenly symphony cannot be brought down to mortal ears.
Elizabeth Bruce was a formidable woman and would later be regarded as one of Sawan Singh's closest disciples. According to Flora Wood in her book In Search of the Way, Elizabeth Bruce was quite ill shortly after the death of her husband and didn't have long to live. As Wood elaborates,
Living conditions were very simple for the 2 or 3 Westerners who were there at any one time, but they found it adequate and restful with an irresistible charm all its own. They were usually housed in the old guest house facing the river or had a room in Dr. Johnson's house. At the time of my first visit, the latter, a well-known American medical practitioner who had lived permanently with his wife at the Dera and had lent his skillful services as both physician and surgeon, free for the purpose of seva, had passed away not long before, and his widow continued to live there, practicing her considerable skill as a herbalist. She had, however, unfortunately contracted severe dysentery and was very weak and ill while I was there. Normally, she prepared her own meals, but this had become increasingly difficult, and trained help was almost unobtainable in this isolated spot. For a time, we considered the possibility of my being her companion housekeeper and nurse, but this proved impracticable. The master in his wisdom knew she only had a short while to live. I shall never forget the quality of those days spent in her company. She was a tall, spare woman with red gold hair. One would not have called her good-looking, but there was a slow refinement about her.
She was clearly held in high esteem at the Dera, up until her death at a relatively young age in the 1940s. According to Flora Wood, Sawan Singh had bestowed on her, Elizabeth Bruce, the epithet Guru Pyari, beloved of the master, and even convincingly pleaded for the young British woman to be initiated, despite her mediating ways that she promised to give up. Paul Petzoldt. Dr. Julian Johnson and his wife, Elizabeth Bruce Johnson, she had taken on her husband's last name after their marriage, spent most of their time at the Dera, where they were engaged in serving the larger Sangat, which was growing significantly each year as Sawan Singh attracted more followers from various parts of India. The summers in the Punjab, however, are so brutally hot that many foreigners and Indians head to the hill stations. In the summer of 1938, the Johnsons settled in Kashmir. It was here that they first met with Paul Petzoldt, 1908 to 1999, a young and ambitious mountain climber from Creston, Iowa, who at the then unheard age of 16 had successfully scaled the Grand Teton in northwestern Wyoming. The reason Paul was in India at this time was because, according to his New York Times obituary, he was asked to join an American team reconnoitering a route up K2, the world's second highest mountain at 28,250 feet in Pakistan's Karakoram Range.
He had no real expedition experience, but he was a darned good climber,
recalled Mr. Petzoldt's teammate Robert H. Bates, who is the honorary president of the American Alpine Club, which Mr. Petzoldt later joined. Running short of food, the team chose Mr. Petzoldt to rope up with its leader, Charles S. Houston, for a last push. Swapping leads with Dr. Houston, Mr. Petzoldt climbed, without supplementary oxygen, to 26,000 feet, then a record for American alpinists. After this remarkable feat, Paul Petzoldt and the climbing party settled in Srinagar, Kashmir. Ray C. Ringholtz, in her moving biography On Belay, The Life of Legendary Mountaineer Paul Petzoldt, describes what happened next. The American team rented a houseboat in the royal family, where they officially closed the expedition with high tea. They spent a few days boating on Lake Dal, visiting the fabled Shalimar Gardens, and sorting out equipment before sailing back to America. Then one evening, while they were sipping cocktails, someone said,
"It seems foolish to have come this far and then sailed directly home without seeing more of the Far East. Why not hire a bus and driver?"
Another chimed in.
"Drive from Rawalpindi up through the Khyber Pass, and then tour Afghanistan and Iran on the way home."
Everybody thought this was a grand idea and decided to cash in their return tickets, except Petzoldt. There was no way he could afford such a trip. Unlike the others, he couldn't wire home for a couple $1,000s if he needed it. But he was damned if he'd admit it.
"I'm going to stay on in India a while,"
he told them.
Paul Petzoldt had a deep interest in Eastern religions, even if he himself was a seasoned skeptic of the so-called miracles attributed to spiritualists and yogis. During his excursions around the countryside in Srinagar, Paul met with Dr. Johnson and Elizabeth Bruce. According to various accounts, Petzoldt was deeply impressed by Johnson's wide education and erudition, and they formed a friendly bond. Footnote. Petzoldt explains, "So while I was there, I was very interested in sadhus. Very interesting to see how these people try to escape from reality. But I happened to meet Dr. Johnson, who is one of the 3 most educated men I've ever known. We got along famously." End footnote. Eventually, Johnson, aware that Paul was financially strapped, invited him to work as his assistant at the Dera. Johnson's health had taken a toll while living in India under its harsh conditions, and having a very strong and healthy young man to assist him in his surgery duties would be quite helpful. At the end of that summer, Ringholtz claims it was late August, Paul Petzoldt came down from Srinagar and settled in at Dera Baba Jamal Singh, near the banks of the Beas River in the Punjab. Paul's first wife, Bernice Patricia McGarity, hadn't seen her husband for months. They first met in the fall of 1931 at the University of Wyoming. So arrangements were made for her to voyage from Seattle, Washington to India a couple of months later. It must have been both an adventurous and worrying time for the young woman, who, being raised Catholic, had never traveled alone, and was quite unprepared to meet an Indian guru who practiced an exotic meditational practice called Surat Shabad Yoga, which focused on seeing inner light and hearing divine inner sounds. In late December, Paul Petzoldt had traveled to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to meet his wife and help her travel to the Radhaswami Center. They arrived 6 days later on January 3rd, 1939. Ominously, just 22 days later, Julian Johnson would be killed. According to Patricia Petzoldt's personal version of her trip to India, recounted 14 years later in her widely cited book On Top of the World, 1953, she felt uncomfortable on her arrival, not quite sure what to make of the widespread poverty in India and the sanitary conditions. A close analysis of her account, where she describes in detail meeting with Dr. Julian Johnson, his wife Elizabeth, Mr. and Mrs. Harry Rimston, David Elliott, pictured on the cover of this book wearing a hat, Bhagat Singh, among others, indicates that she both admired and felt comfortable with Dr. Johnson. She didn't feel the same about Elizabeth Bruce, who she viewed as reserved and intimidating. It is also clear from the narrative that even though she was ambivalent about Radhaswami and his very devoted following, she was impressed by Sawan Singh. As she recalls of her first meeting,
"As the master stood in his flowing white robes, he made a wonderful picture. He was a very handsome man of perhaps 50.
Footnote: Patricia is 30 years off about Sawan Singh's age. The guru was 81 at the time she met him. End footnote.
His effect on the people was miraculous. They sat motionless like stone figures. Before he started speaking, he gazed long and silently in the distance. I must confess, he didn't seem quite human to me. I've never encountered such presence."
Bhagat Singh. Another key figure at this time that would eventually play a pivotal role in Paul Petzoldt's life was Bhagat Singh, a highly placed lawyer from Jalandhar, who was one of Sawan Singh's closest and most trusted disciples. In fact, Bhagat Singh was so well regarded that in 1938 he was considered to be Sawan Singh's eventual successor. Johnson writes about him and his positional status in a letter on March 6, 1933. See With the Great Master in India. We may next introduce Sardar Bhagat Singh, a cousin of the Professor Jagat Singh, although in this country they speak of cousins as brothers. He is an attorney at law in Jalandhar city, about 27 miles from here. In this country, an attorney registered to practice before the High Court is called an advocate. Sardar Bhagat Singh is one of the recognized outstanding men of his profession in all the Punjab. He is a man of medium height, rather heavy-set, with slightly gray beard, and a benevolent smile that betokens a kind heart and a radiant soul. He is a lovable man, and it is a delight to know him. He is highly educated, of a keen and discriminating intelligence, and he is a very successful lawyer. He is outstanding proof that a lawyer can make an honest living, for his honesty and integrity are beyond question. He attends to all the legal work of the master, relating to the many business affairs of the center. He may aptly be called the Prime Minister of the Master, a title which is commonly given him by satsangis. Even though Paul Petzoldt was intrigued by Radhaswami, particularly the meditation practice and his promises of higher forms of consciousness, he wasn't yet convinced of the philosophy and didn't strictly follow the vows that were required of those seeking initiation, which included not eating meat, fish, or eggs, and abstaining from alcohol. According to Paul's wife's recollection in On Top of the World, on their first night together at the spiritual center,
"Paul rummaged around and found a bottle of scotch and mixed us a couple of stiff drinks. We sat sipping the drinks and listening to the screaming of jackals and other strange sounds in the distance."
Both of them were very fond of Dr. Julian Johnson, and Bernice Patricia reflected that
"He was gentle and kind and seemed genuinely glad I was there."
The turning point. Yet, not everything was going smoothly. In particular, Paul's wife got sick.
I didn't feel particularly well and stayed in my room. The third day I felt better and went to my meals. I'd been feeling nauseated and noticed a peculiar ringing in my ears. The ringing was accompanied by dizzy spells and shortness of breath. After each meal I vomited. Then for a day or two I would feel better, but later I'd be quite ill again. After about a week of this, I finally awoke one morning and was too ill to get out of bed.
All the existent records concerning Paul Petzoldt's and his wife's stay at the Dera, which include court documents, letters, and later recollections, agree that the turning point in their relationship with Elizabeth Bruce revolve around Paul's wife getting sick. They were suspicious that Dr. Johnson's wife had somehow tampered with Bernice Patricia Petzoldt's food, and that because of this she was not getting better. Why they were both suspicious of Elizabeth Bruce's cooking isn't clear, except that Paul felt he and his wife were not getting the same meals as the others. This, as we will see, was one of the tipping points that would lead to an intense argument between Elizabeth Bruce and Paul Petzoldt that would tragically, even if unintentionally, lead to the death of Dr. Julian P. Johnson. In a February 4, 1939 letter to Dr. Charles Houston, a mountaineering colleague, Paul Petzoldt alleges, "We were eating from the same kitchen, and there was also a misunderstanding concerning food. One evening, I went to complain about the food because they were eating one food and sending us another type, contrary to our agreement." 14 years later, Patricia Petzoldt elaborated about the food issue.
"The third evening I felt much better and I was hungry. Paul said he was going to get me something hot from the sanitarium's dining room. I said, 'Do you think it is safe?' Paul said, 'I'll make sure it is. I'll bring along what's served me. It's all that we can do. You can't live on peeled fruit, and there's no way of getting hot, clean food in the village.'" When Mrs. Barker, note,
cover name used for Mrs. Johnson,
had asked why Paul hadn't been bringing me food. He had said I was too ill to eat. She hadn't been to see me, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. She wasn't a particularly friendly soul at best.
Ray C. Rinholz, who personally interviewed Paul Petzoldt 5 decades after Johnson's death in the 1990s, explains this about the food controversy.
Although Bernice's fertile imagination convinced her that she was being poisoned, Petzoldt thought it far more likely that Mrs. Johnson tainted the food to make her a little sick and teach her a lesson. The chance that his wife suffered from the typical intestinal problems endured by most newcomers to India was also possible. Nevertheless, he thought it wise to control what she ate for a while.
Footnote. In an interview on June 27, 1996, Paul Petzoldt admitted Bernice, his wife,
was a very imaginative person,
but anybody that comes to India is apt to get ill.
I can say this, she was ill and we thought it was the food, but then everybody becomes ill in India.
I thought Mrs. Johnson may have been doing something to make her ill, but I didn't think she was trying to kill her. End footnote. It is precisely at this point that we need to pause and provide some background before proceeding, since what happened next is confusing, and is exactly why there has been so many variant stories about how Dr. Julian P. Johnson died. 1. We need to appreciate the setting. It is winter in the Punjab, and there are just a handful of Westerners in a fairly remote area, with a newly arrived American woman who not only gets very ill within weeks, but who also feels that she's being perceived as a negative influence. While Patricia Petzoldt's book, On Top of the World, cannot be completely trusted as an honest and objective account, we will see shortly that she fictionalized several key elements in her narrative, it does reveal to some measure her emotional fluctuations. We should no doubt read the following passages with ample skepticism.
At one point, well along in the sermon,
Sawan Singh's evening satsang,
I was horrified to see the entire assembly staring at me, and even the English professor from Bombay was concentrating on me now. I whispered to him, "What's the matter? Why are they staring?" He said, "Because the master tells us there's a new and negative influence among us." He paused and looked at me coldly.
It is unfortunate.
That night, when Paul and I were back in our apartment alone, I confided in him. "You know," I said, "I had a queer feeling when that crowd turned and looked at me. I realized there was nothing to be afraid of, but all the same, I was rather frightened. Do you think I'm silly?" "Of course you aren't silly," Paul said.
"These people are difficult for me to understand, and I've been around them longer than you have. But try to remember that all people are alike. They all respond to kindness and goodwill, regardless of race or creed."
I said, "You're speaking of normal people now."
"These people are normal enough," Paul replied.
"Remember how serious people at home can get about their religion?" I said, "I certainly do. I also remember that they burned witches in Salem not so long ago."
Whether Sawan Singh actually said, "There is a new and a negative influence among us," is questionable, since it appears to be more of a literary device, given that her book has novelized components to it, by Patricia Petzold to develop dramatic tension for what will happen next. Nevertheless, it does seem apparent that Paul's wife felt somewhat uncomfortable in her new surroundings, and wasn't quite sure of her place in it and how to respond to these foreign spiritual teachings. 2. In examining the few days before that led up to Johnson's untimely death, we are hamstrung by the fact that what we have to mostly rely on are ad hoc retellings of what transpired by Paul and Patricia Petzold, both of whom have a deeply vested interest in providing the most positive spin possible to this most tragic occurrence. 3. Radhaswami Satsang Beas is curiously silent on the subject of how Julian Johnson died. In none of their official publications, English, Punjabi, or Urdu, do they explain in detail how Johnson was killed, or the controversy surrounding it. For instance, in the book Dawn of Light, which has a long introduction about how Radhaswami grew in America from 1911 onwards, when writing about Julian Johnson's death, it simply states that he passed away. Footnote. Flora Wood, who is close to Elizabeth Bruce, also claims that Dr. Julian Johnson, quote, passed away, unquote, in her book In Search of the Way. End footnote. The shotgun. The essential trigger point, and the pun here is consciously intended, behind why Julian Johnson was killed on that cold night in January, centered over a shotgun. In a later interview with Ray C. Rinholz, a transcription of which is housed among her many papers at the special collections in the J. Willard Marriott Library at the University of Utah, Paul Petzoldt alleges, "I had this shotgun which was given to me by the head of this group. We kept it loaded at all times because they had outbreaks of rabid dogs. Nobody there would shoot them because they have to take their karma, so he didn't have anybody to shoot the dogs. That shotgun was in the dining room to the corner. A double-barreled shotgun loaded all the time. If someone reported one, rabid dog, I'd grab that and run out and shoot them. Patricia Petzoldt also emphasizes that the shotgun was loaded when she writes in her memoir, he, Paul, knew the gun was loaded because recently it had been used to shoot several mad dogs roaming the village. The reason Paul repeats that the gun is loaded twice in the span of 3 sentences, we kept it loaded at all times, and a double-barrel shotgun loaded all the time, is that it will play a pivotal role later after Johnson's death in his legal defense. The argument. The greatest hurdle in understanding how and why Julian Johnson was killed on January 25, 1939, hovers over an argument earlier that night between Elizabeth Bruce and Paul Petzoldt. There are conflicting reports about what precipitated the dispute, though all accounts seem to agree that one of the chief concerns was over food. There also appears to have been some growing tension between the Petzoldts and Elizabeth Bruce over spiritual matters. Paul and Patricia were not yet firm believers in Radhaswami, and would on occasion voice their skepticism. One specific incident looms large here, but who said what when is still open to debate since we have 2 contrasting accounts of it. The dispute centered around the topic of Kundalini, which is believed in certain Indian yoga systems to be a coiled and usually latent energy force at the base of the human spine that, when released through asanas, pranayama, mudras, and meditation, can awaken one to higher and more blissful states of consciousness, with the end goal of traversing the lower bodily chakras and ascending to the crown chakra, Sahasrara, at the top of the head. In so doing, one can achieve final moksha, or liberation. In Radhaswami satsangs, however, the Kundalini is viewed as a lower force and not equal to the Shabad that carries one far beyond the Sahasrara chakra. In any case, either at dinner that night or before, Paul's version is different than his wife's. There was a lively discussion amongst the Americans about Kundalini, sometimes called the serpent force. Patricia Petzoldt provides her version of what happened. One evening at dinner, the conversation came around to a mysterious thing called Kundalini. Note, Patricia spells Kundalini starting with a C and with 2 Ds. This power was centered at the end of the spine or in the tailbone. Instead of the usual glassy-eyed ecstasy that tales of the master inspired, the whole group became very excited as they talked about the power of the Kundalini. It seemed that if a person could raise the Kundalini, he would automatically become all-powerful and one with God. After an hour of this, I became faintly hysterical, and unfortunately suggested that perhaps a good swift kick might do the trick as well. There was dead silence. Paul looked at me aghast. I would have given anything to retract my words, but there was nothing I could say now. The next morning, I went around and apologized to Mrs. Barker, Elizabeth Bruce. I couldn't tell whether she accepted my apology or not. She smiled vaguely and mysteriously, and continued to stir a pot of herbs she was cooking up. Curiously, though, Paul Petzoldt provides a different scenario about the Kundalini discussion, and claims that he was the one who made the remark, inferring that it led to an altercation between him and Elizabeth Bruce. As Paul recollects some 50 years later, the crack I made was poor judgment. They were talking about raising their Kundalini. The spelling here, Cutalini, may be due to how the recording was transcribed by Ray C. Ringholtz, as she changes it in her book. Indian mysticism. I was interested in mysticism. This Kundalini in Indian mysticism is a sort of thermometer in our back. If you do the right thing all the time and live like you should, according to this guru, you can gradually raise this Kundalini. If you raise it and it connects with your brain, you're clairvoyant, one with eternity, and you never have to come back to India. That's why everybody celebrates when they die. So they were talking about this Kundalini, and I made a terrible remark. I said, I wonder if a little kick in the butt might help. Pat, Patricia, his wife, wasn't in there when this happened. Paul Petzoldt, unlike his wife's story, clearly suggests that his off-color remark is what caused Elizabeth Bruce to go into a rage. Whereas Patricia's account in her book, On Top of the World, blames it over Paul wanting to bring food back from the kitchen by himself without Elizabeth Bruce's assistance. He, Paul, had gone to the dining room and the usual crowd was assembled at the table. Dr. and Mrs. Barker, Julian Johnson and Elizabeth Bruce, Dr. Dunbar, Donald Elliott, from Kansas, the couple from California, Mr. and Mrs. Larry L. Rimston, and the young Indian attorney from Lahore, Bhagat Singh. Paul had sat down. After he had been served, he gathered up some silverware, pushed his chair back, and picking up the plate of food started for the door. Mrs. Barker, Elizabeth Bruce, said, "Where are you going?" "I'm taking this to Mrs. Petzoldt," Paul replied. "Let me have it, Mrs. Barker," Elizabeth Bruce said, "and I'll send one of the servants with it. Or better still, I'll have a plate fixed in the kitchen and sent to her room." But Paul hung onto the plate of food. He said, "No, thank you, Mrs. Barker, don't bother. I'd rather take it to her myself." By this time, Mrs. Barker had risen and stood, clutching the table in an agitated manner. As Paul started toward the door, she screeched, "Give me that plate!" Paul paused and said coldly, "Perhaps you have something you'd like to add to it?" Then she scrambled from her seat behind the table, and with a strangled cry ran out of the dining room into the courtyard. The people sat around the table in stunned silence. Whatever happened on that fateful night in late January 1939, whether it was insulting comments about the food or about how to raise the kundalini, Paul Petzoldt and Elizabeth Bruce were at the center of a ferocious argument that would leave one person dead and another charged with murder. On the surface of it, the story, as told by various sides concerning how the argument escalated into a physical altercation, makes no sense. Why would anyone get so angry with a husband taking food back to his off-and-on sick wife? Or why would an offhand remark about raising the kundalini by "a little kick in the butt might help" generate such outrage? Moreover, why would a rugged man and world-class mountaineer refer to this latter comment as terrible? Is such a statement really that awful, or is there more to the statement than he is letting on? Did Paul use something a bit more earthy or profane? Moreover, did Paul's own anger have something to do with escalating the whole affair? I mention this because in a revealing interview with Molly Absalon, more than 50 years later, Paul Petzoldt admits he, quote, "lost his cool and made an openly derogatory comment about the people's beliefs," end quote. And if Patricia's version is to be believed, why was everyone so aghast when this young, naive, non-believing American woman suggested that perhaps a good swift kick might do the trick as well? Something is off here, and there appears to be a missing part of the puzzle, unless, of course, we acknowledge that humans can be set off and act in bizarre ways by even the slightest of invectives. The historical context is important, because what we may find innocuous today may be perceived 6 decades prior quite differently. Clearly, Paul and Patricia were not getting along well with Elizabeth Bruce, despite their obvious warm regard for her husband, Dr. Johnson. One of the factors that are not prominently mentioned in either two major books, On Top of the World and On Belay, is the subject of finances. Paul and his wife were cash poor. So much so, in fact, that they had to take third-class tickets in order to stay just one extra night in Delhi. Paul Petzoldt, in his first letter to Charles Houston dated February 4th, 1939, speaks directly to his financial situation and why he first aligned himself with Dr. Johnson and his wife. "I stayed on in India because I was offered a business proposition by Dr. Johnson. 2 Americans had promised an interest in a business, a monthly salary, and transportation to India for my wife, and transportation back to the U.S. The plans were disappointing because they did not keep our original promises." Whether or not money played a part in the argument between Elizabeth and Paul that night is left unstated. Nevertheless, it is worthy to note that right after discussing his money problems, Paul Petzoldt immediately brings up a misunderstanding concerning food. This indicates that food was enough of a contentious issue that Paul felt it necessary to mention it in a brief letter, trying to defend himself against murder charges, just 9 days after Johnson being killed. It may well be that the real reason Elizabeth Bruce got so upset with Paul Petzoldt had less to do with his or his wife's deprecating remarks about Kundalini, and more to do with her cooking and insinuating that it was making his wife sick. If Patricia's remembrance is to be accepted, then, quote, "it was always after Elizabeth Bruce's meals that I suddenly felt the worst," she told Dr. Johnson. After admitting this to him, Patricia said she was suddenly shocked and frightened and cold, suggesting that the implications of such a correlation, Bruce's food and her sickness, made her worried about her safety. As Patricia Petzoldt retells it, "When he, Dr. Johnson, was gone, I looked at the breakfast tray. Paul also looked at it, and I could see he was thinking the same thing I was. 'We may be mistaken, of course,' he said, 'but we won't take any chances. Don't touch the food on the tray. I'll go to the market and get something to tide you over. Then we'll see what we can do.'" The fight. We may never precisely know all the varied reasons why Elizabeth Bruce and Paul Petzoldt got into a vicious fight that night, but we do know that Patricia Petzoldt was not there when it happened. This is important because everything she learned about it later was retold directly by her husband Paul. The earliest documented account we have of what happened that night is from Paul Petzoldt in his February 4th, 1939 letter to Charles Houston. This is crucial because what he states in it will be both modified and contradicted in later testimony. Keep in mind that the context for what he writes in the following is prefaced about his complaints about the food. Writes Paul, Miss Bruce, whom I believe to be somewhat insane, grabbed a shotgun and tried to shoot me. I avoided the aim of the gun by some desperate dodging, and later, before she could shoot, managed to get hold of the bow of the gun and to keep it from being pointed at me. While I was holding the gun from being pointed at me, Dr. Johnson and David Elliott and an Indian, Bhagat Singh, were giving me fist blows around the head. This happened outside the house in the courtyard. I knew if I didn't escape at once, I would be shot. I decided to make a run for it. I let go of the gun and struck out. It was quite dark. I didn't know whom I hit, but I must have delivered a fist blow to Dr. Johnson, for he fell to the pavement. His head hit the pavement, and he died several hours later from concussion. 14 years later, Paul's wife gave this portrayal of how Dr. Johnson died. Mrs. Barker, Elizabeth Bruce, ran from the courtyard into the living rooms which adjoined the dining room. Both the living and dining rooms had doors open onto the courtyard.
"I'll kill you!"
she screamed at the top of her voice.
"I'm going to kill you!"
Through the dining room door, Paul saw her run to the corner of the living room and pick up a shotgun propped there in the corner. He knew the gun was loaded because recently it had been used to shoot several mad dogs roaming the village. He dropped the plate of food and ran toward her. She had the shotgun pointed at him and he twisted it sideways. She fought like a madwoman. As strong as Paul is, he could scarcely hold his own against her. Dr. Barker, Julian Johnson, was behind his wife now trying to get the gun from her and talking in a calm voice in an attempt to quiet her, but she was beyond reason. While Paul was struggling with Mrs. Barker, Elizabeth Bruce, the Indian attorney, Bhagat Singh, jumped on Paul's back. Paul was surprised and really frightened now. He was afraid that these queer people might all turn against him. So he threw the Indian, Bhagat Singh, off his back, at the same time jerking the gun from Mrs. Barker's grasp. Then he threw the gun out a window, whirled around, and ran out of the living room door into the courtyard. Why Dr. Barker happened to be coming through that door at this particular moment is unexplainable. A second before, he had been behind Mrs. Barker, trying to get her to drop the gun. Perhaps he had stepped out to call a servant. Anyway, as Paul ran through the door, the two men collided, and Dr. Barker was thrown backward, his head striking the stone courtyard when he fell. Paul stopped, picked up the old man, and carried him to a couch in the living room. While he was doing this, Mrs. Barker continued to beat him about the head and face with her fists. Then old Mr. Dunbar, David Elliott, who until now had kept out of the general melee, suddenly stepped up and slapped her smartly on either cheek. Instead of quieting her, this only made her more violent. Footnote. Interestingly, Patricia's claim that Mr. Dunbar's, David Elliott's, intervention only made her more violent is almost the precise inverse of the story first told to the police, where it was David Elliott who, quote, was the person whose interference to protect Dr. Johnson from Petzoldt attack so infuriated Petzoldt that he took a swing, instead, at Elliott, but missing him when the latter ducked, the blow struck Dr. Johnson full in the face and knocked him down. End quote. The juxtaposition is revealing in itself. End footnote. She succeeded in pushing Paul out of the room and locking the door behind him, and that is how it all happened. The problem with Patricia Petzoldt's account is that it contradicts key parts of her husband's explanation of what happened. Keep in mind that Patricia's recollection was written and published 14 years after Paul's. In his letter to Charles Houston, Paul Petzoldt claims that he was being beaten by 3 people, including Mr. Elliott, as he struggled for the shotgun from Elizabeth Bruce. In his wife's account, however, she claims that David Elliott, Mr. Dunbar, had kept out of the general melee, and when he did involve himself, he slapped Elizabeth Bruce across both cheeks, but to no avail. In addition, Paul admits to giving a fist blow to Dr. Johnson, but his wife merely says they accidentally collided. Footnote. Perhaps a more significant discrepancy, and one that raises serious questions about the reliability of either story, is this. In Paul's earliest version of the fight, it occurs outside the house in the courtyard, whereas in his wife's version, the fight takes place inside the house. This is significant because her subsequent explanation for why Johnson gets hurt and dies is garbled when she writes, quote, why Dr. Barker, Julian Johnson, happened to be coming through the door at this particular moment is unexplainable. A second before, he had been behind Mrs. Barker, Elizabeth Bruce, trying to get her to drop the gun inside the house. End footnote. Moreover, Patricia Petzoldt appears to have completely invented the part about Paul picking up Dr. Johnson after he collided with him and carrying him to a couch. In Ray C. Ringholtz's elaboration of the event, Paul Petzoldt, quote, collided with the old man, Dr. Johnson. He heard someone fall to the stone floor, but didn't dare stop to investigate who it was. He could hear screaming behind him as he fled. End quote. Why the discrepancy? Undoubtedly, Patricia Petzoldt is trying to spin the death of Dr. Johnson in a light most favorable to her husband, and thus adds fictionalized details that didn't happen at the time. She even goes so far as to say that they both attended Julian Johnson's funeral at the Bayas River, even though Paul Petzoldt himself admits that such a thing never happened. Therefore, though parts of her narrative are authentic, many other sections are weaved wholly out of cloth. The most egregious error in Ringholtz's book is when she plagiarizes from C. E. Macy's memorandum and puts his direct observation of Mrs. Johnson's influence on the Dera residents and places it wholesale, without attribution or justification, in a speech given by Bhagat Singh, even though there is absolutely no record that he said anything of the sort. Her motive for doing something so duplicitous is to make Bhagat Singh sound like a conniving mastermind in a plot to save the Dera and his guru from scandal. Compare the following excerpts to see how Ringholtz lifted from C. E. Macy and utilized it as part of Bhagat Singh's own words. C. E. Macy describing his own observation, April 3, 1939. Mrs. Johnson was in complete control of everything said or done there. It was especially evident that the elderly gentleman, Donald Elliot, was under her influence and apparently afraid of her. Ray C. Ringholtz, writing some 55 years later, lifts C. E. Macy's perception of Mrs. Johnson and then incorporates it as part of Bhagat Singh's plot to convince Petzoldt to accept his fabrication of how Dr. Johnson died. Quote, Mrs. Johnson is in complete control of everything said or done at the complex. He, Bhagat Singh, said. It is especially evident that the elderly gentleman, Donald Elliot, is under her influence and apparently afraid of her. End quote. Notice that Ringholtz's wording is exactly the same as Macy's, but with only one verb change, was to is. Prior to plagiarizing Macy's memorandum, Ringholtz incorporates and adds to Patricia Petzoldt's 1953 book, On Top of the World, that also paints a negative picture concerning Bhagat Singh. How accurate or honest this portrait is of the Indian lawyer and devotee is open to speculation. A few hours later, she, Patricia Petzoldt, came back to tell him Johnson had died at 1 o'clock in the morning. They sat by the fireplace trying to figure out what they would do next. Someone knocked on the door. It was Bhagat Singh, the attorney, and devotee of Sawan Singh. He wanted to talk with him before the police arrived. Singh explained that one of the main tenets of the Radhaswami cult was peace and passive resistance to attack. Scandal and publicity, which would result from revealing Mrs. Johnson had brandished a shotgun in a quarrel with other inmates of the colony, would be extremely damaging. He told the Petzoldts that he had fabricated an official explanation of the accident and instructed all the other witnesses to testify accordingly. If Petzoldt would go along with the statement and plead guilty, they would get the charge of culpable homicide reduced to one of simple hurt. If he didn't cooperate, the cult would make a very bad case against him. The trouble with Ringholtz's rendition is that she twists and adds details that are entirely absent in Patricia's original version, which reads, While Paul and I sat in our room talking and trying to decide what to do next, we heard steps outside and a knock on the door. It was the Indian attorney, Bhagat Singh. He was very excited and wanted to speak to us before the police arrived. They'll be here any minute now, he said. Mrs. Barker, Elizabeth Bruce, sent for them hours ago. Paul said, Did she send for a doctor too? The attorney said no, he didn't think so. He said, Listen please, Mr. Petzoldt. We do not want notoriety here. We both know there's been an accident tonight. It is a case of simple hurt, you understand? We will say that Dr. Barker, Julian Johnson, was coming through the door as you were going out. That is true. Nothing must be mentioned of the quarrel, or the reasons for the quarrel, or the gun, or the struggle. It is much better this way for all of us. Don't you think so? Mrs. Barker just gets confused at times, that's all. She's not a bad woman, and she is suffering now from the loss of her husband. Notice how the tone is more muted in Patricia's story than Ringholtz's reconstruction, although both versions were written years after the fact and rely heavily on Paul Petzoldt. Adding to this mix is Ray C. Ringholtz's attempt to connect all the pieces together into a cohesive mosaic. But even here there are discrepancies that bubble forth, not the least of which is that she ignores Paul Petzoldt's earliest version of what happened, as told in his letter to Charles Houston, in favor of recollections made years later about the event. Nevertheless, Due to her diligent research in this regard, her retelling is valuable and instructive, even if we should be cautious in accepting everything in her reconstruction. Mrs. Johnson wailed, pushed her chair aside, and bolted for the courtyard. While everyone watched in stunned disbelief, she ran from the yard back into the room. Petzoldt saw her going for the shotgun. He dropped the plate and rushed through the door connecting the dining and living rooms. Just as he reached Mrs. Johnson, she aimed the gun at him point blank. He grabbed the stock and twisted it sideways, but the hysterical woman fought him off, and it was all he could do to keep control of the weapon. While Petzoldt struggled with Mrs. Johnson, Dr. Johnson rushed up behind his wife and tried to convince her to release the gun. Recognizing that she was beyond reasoning, he hurried into the courtyard, probably intent on summoning servants for help. Meanwhile, Elliot and the attorney Singh ran into the room and jumped on Petzoldt's back, pummeling him on the head. Petzoldt shrugged off the two men and wrenched the shotgun from Mrs. Johnson's hands. Then he threw the gun out of an open window and bolted into the dark courtyard just as Dr. Johnson returned. Not seeing who it was, and intent on his escape, Petzoldt collided with the old man. He heard someone fall to the stone floor, but didn't dare stop to investigate who it was. He could hear screaming behind him as he fled. Footnote. In Paul Petzoldt's early account to Houston, he claims that Johnson was hitting him. However, in later accounts, both Ringholtz and his wife claim Johnson was only trying to calm his wife down, not take swings at Paul. Why the discordance? Is it because Paul Petzoldt wants to feign ignorance about who he knocked down, thus lending more credence to his "it was an accident" hypothesis with no ill intent? One counter-theory, which has been discussed among those conversant with Dr. Johnson's death, is that it was Paul's anger at being jumped on which led him to punching his way out, and thus he knowingly hit Johnson, which made him fall, even if that very punch wasn't meant to kill him. Claiming he didn't know who he hit, even if he actually did, while trying to escape clears Paul Petzoldt of any ill intention, and thus provides evidence for his plea of simple hurt. End footnote. Bernice, Patricia, alarmed at the commotion, threw on some clothes and hurried out to see what was causing the disturbance. She met Petzoldt on the stairs. "Oh, God! Something terrible has happened," he said. He told her about Mrs. Johnson's fury over the plate, how she had threatened him with a shotgun, his desperate escape. "I knocked someone down in the courtyard," he said. "I think he might be hurt." Petzoldt didn't dare return to the main house yet. He asked Bernice to find out who he had bumped into and check his condition. By the time Bernice got to the Johnson residence, the gate was locked. She talked a servant into letting her in. When she entered the living room, she saw the other guests milling about somberly. Johnson was lying unconscious on the couch. He was bleeding from the nose. Streaks of blood stained his long white beard, and his breathing was labored. Mrs. Johnson, looking dazed, bent over him. Bernice watched them for a few minutes, then returned to the apartment. She put her arms around Petzoldt and told him it was Johnson that he had run into. "How is he?" he asked. "I can't tell. He's bleeding some. Perhaps he's dying." Finally, Petzoldt said, "Go back in and come out every so often, and tell me how he's getting along." A few hours later, she came back to tell him Johnson had died at 1 o'clock in the morning. In deciphering precisely what happened, we seem left to a Rashomon moment, where each participant has a slightly different angle of what happened that fateful night. Footnote. Molly Absalon's 1995 interview with Paul Petzoldt, published in The Leader, provides another version of what happened the night Johnson died. "After my wife got there, I was persona non grata by everybody. Everybody," Paul says, shaking his head. One evening, the tension came to a head. Paul, as he says, lost his cool and made an openly derogatory comment about the people's beliefs. His remark caused an uproar. Paul found himself wrestling with one of the followers for control of a shotgun he'd been carrying to curb an outbreak of rabid dogs. In the ensuing struggle, he threw the gun out of the window, broke away from the hysterical crowd, and rushed out of the building. As he hurried off, he ran into the doctor, who, not knowing what was going on, grabbed Paul. Always a big, strong man, Paul easily pushed the doctor away and left without looking back. The doctor, frail and small, fell to the ground, hit his head, and died. End footnote. A telegram, which contained Paul Petzoldt's official declaration of what transpired, was forwarded to the Consulate General at Calcutta. It was posted in all caps. "No murder motive. Petzoldt case. Merely tragic accident. Resulting scuffle. Ill-advised, pleaded guilty. Stop. Are two young Americans in trouble. Not entirely their fault. Stop. Urgently recommend friends extend financial aid. Stop. Please cable Loomis, care Houston, 50 Haven Avenue, New York. Extremely urgent. Provide sufficient funds for immediate repatriation. Petzoldt and wife. Stop. If you can get assurance these funds forthcoming, believe can move government successfully, suspension sentence upon assurance, leave India at once. Stop. Mailing affidavit.
The trial. What happened next is even more confusing than the fight and Dr. Johnson's death. Apparently, Paul Petzoldt was advised by Bhagat Singh, a prominent lawyer at the Dera, and alleged to be next in line to succeed the guru at Beas, to plead guilty for killing Julian Johnson. In the Memorandum Concerning Protection case involving Paul Petzoldt and wife, prepared by C.E. Macy, the American consul in Karachi, India, April 3, 1939, quote, "The accused had pleaded guilty to a charge of simple hurt after having originally booked on a charge of culpable homicide. This charge of simple hurt to which Petzoldt had pleaded guilty carried a maximum sentence of 1 year imprisonment, a fine of rupees 1,000 or both." End quote. The problem with such a strategy, according to C.E. Macy, was that, quote, even though Petzoldt's statement in his affidavit about what had happened at Dera Baba Jamal Singh on the evening of January 25, 1939, might be accepted as correct, his plea of guilty had more or less effectively stopped any effort in court to help him, for, of course, an appeal cannot be made from a sentence imposed following a plea of guilty. End quote. Paul Petzoldt was originally booked on a charge of culpable homicide, but later, apparently on the advice of Bhagat Singh or perhaps others at the Dera, he pleaded guilty to simple hurt, which is similar to a manslaughter charge in America where one kills someone without malice. This lesser charge was a double-edged sword, however, since it meant that Paul Petzoldt faced jail time, and it would hinder his case in introducing a central piece in his defense, which was that Elizabeth Bruce had allegedly threatened him with a shotgun. It was his reaction to that, Petzoldt argued, and not any ill intention against those in attendance, that caused him to accidentally kill Dr. Johnson. If, however, he didn't plead guilty to a lesser charge, he might face a much worse consequence than a year in jail. Now, this is where the story gets even muddier. According to Paul Petzoldt and those siding with him, which included C.E. Macy and Chief Justice Sir Douglas Young from Lahore, who was instrumental in securing Mr. Bakshi Bhagat Ram as the defense attorney in the case, the reason he pleaded guilty, even if to a much reduced charge, was because of the advice of Bhagat Singh, not to be confused with Bakshi Bhagat Ram, the prominent attorney and successor in waiting at Dera Baba Jamal Singh. This becomes a very contentious issue for Petzoldt and his defenders because he feels that the Dera wanted to avoid bad publicity for their guru and his center, since a murder charge would bring unwanted media attention. As C.E. Macy argues in his April 3, 1939 memorandum, quote, further investigation in the colony after leaving the Americans convinced the writer, C.E. Macy, that what had probably happened was about this, that Bhagat Singh, the public prosecutor at Jalandhar, and whose car brought the doctor the night of Dr. Johnson's untimely death, had concocted a story for all concerned to tell. His reason for doing so was that, as he is slated to be the next guru, or spiritual head of the sect, footnote, it is particularly fascinating to learn that as early as 1938 or 1939, that Bhagat Singh was regarded to be Sawan Singh's future successor. Most Beas satsangis are unaware of this little-known tidbit of information. It's also important to note that in the early 1940s when Sawan Singh took gravely ill, a will was made just in case he died, appointing Bhagat Singh as his successor. Even though Sawan Singh did recover from his sickness, Bhagat Singh died just a few years later. In 1948, Sawan Singh appointed Bhagat Singh's cousin, Jagat Singh, as his successor at the Dera. Others also claimed succession from Sawan Singh, with Kirpal Singh being the most prominent. For more on succession history, see Mark Juergensmeyer's Radhaswami Reality, 1991, and my own Radhaswami Tradition, 1992. End footnote. One of whose main tenets is peace and passive resistance if attacked. He could see no good whatever for the colony in the scandal and publicity, which news of Mrs. Johnson, Elizabeth Bruce, having brandished a gun and a quarrel with other inmates would cause. Therefore, in connivance with the head, or at least some high official of the Beas police station, a story had been concocted, and as all the witnesses told the same story when the Criminal Investigation Department operatives from Amritsar arrived at Dera Baba Jamal Singh on or about 3:00 p.m. on the afternoon of January 26, 1939, some 15 hours after Dr. Johnson's demise, the police had no reason to smell a rat. End quote. If C.E. Macy's report is taken as credible, Bhagat Singh and perhaps others had concocted a story that would both give a lighter sentence to Petzoldt and at the same time
obviate any mention of Elizabeth Bruce brandishing a shotgun. The problem, though, is that we are only getting one side of the story, since we don't have documented reports from either Bhagat Singh or the Dera residents that were involved. The case dragged along until March 10th, which was being tried in Amritsar, and which necessitated Petzoldt's attorney, Mr. Bakshi Bhagat Ram, to make 8 trips to the city from Lahore before his client was finally acquitted. The turning point in Paul Petzoldt's acquittal was, according to his attorney, due to C.E. Macy's efforts to bring out the truth, particularly getting Elizabeth to acknowledge the shotgun incident. Macy's personal visit to the Dera on February 10th was pivotal in securing Petzoldt's release, since he was able to interview those who witnessed the altercation that night and elicit exculpatory information favorable to the defense. As Macy recalls, the writer, Macy, was free from other work by noon of the 10th, February, and left at once by motor for Dera Baba Jamal Singh. When he arrived there, he found Mrs. Johnson the widow, Mr. and Mrs. Harry L. Rimston, and David Elliott, all Americans residing in the colony where the quarrel had taken place. They were all very much upset. Discreet questioning brought out quickly that the story told at the trial had been a concocted one, but those concerned persisted in asserting that they had told it with the best of motives, i.e. to save Petzoldt from being indicted for murder. It was brought out that a gun had been brandished, as Petzoldt asserted, but Mrs. Johnson kept reiterating that the weapon was not loaded. The writer's definite impression was, after having talked with the Americans in the Radhaswami colony at Dera Baba Jamal Singh, that Mrs. Johnson was in complete control of everything said or done there. It was especially evident that the elderly gentleman, Donald Elliott, was under her influence and apparently afraid of her. Elliott was the man who, in the story first told in the court, was the person whose interference to protect Dr. Johnson from Petzoldt's attack so infuriated Petzoldt that he took a swing at Elliott, but missing him when the latter ducked, the blow struck Dr. Johnson full in the face and knocked him down, the back of his head striking the concrete door sill as he fell. Clearly, Elizabeth Bruce using a shotgun, for whatever reason, offensively or defensively, is the troublesome issue and why there's no ultra-clear narrative concerning what generated such a row and how Johnson died. That Elizabeth Bruce wants to recuse herself from holding the gun is telling, and even when she admits to using it, wants everyone to know it was unloaded in contradistinction with Paul Petzoldt, who was adamant that it was. In either case, however, it provided Paul Petzoldt's defense with enough reasonable doubt to have the case against him dismissed. The shotgun issue probably wouldn't have emerged if it weren't for the American consul's interview with Mr. Rimston, who admitted that his early testimony wasn't fully truthful. As Macy recounts, he, Mr. Rimston, seemed worried, however, about how he could change the story without subjecting himself to the pains and penalties of perjury. It was his testimony that more or less forced Elizabeth Bruce to admit brandishing a shotgun during the incident. Of course, what motivated Elizabeth Bruce to pick up the gun in the first place, her cooking, Paul's insults, is undetermined. It is important to note, however, that both books on the subject, On Top of the World and On Belay, contain a number of fabrications. Particularly troublesome is Ray Ringholtz's reportage. She claims the trial started on March 10th and lasted 3 days, and Petzoldt was acquitted on March 12th. Yet, Petzoldt's own attorney wrote to Mr. Macy on March 10th at 1:15 p.m. that the judgment was made on March 9th and that Paul Petzoldt had wired Bakshi Bhagat Ram about it, to which Ram wired back with, quote, "Delighted innocence vindicated," end quote. Why such a discrepancy? Unfortunately, to make her retelling of the trial more dramatic, Ringholtz conflated parts of Patricia Petzoldt's novelized version of it as recast in On Top of the World. The problem with doing such is that several parts of that book are completely made up, a point that Paul Petzoldt readily admitted to Ringholtz. What we do know for relative certainty is that Paul Petzoldt had changed his original plea from guilty to innocent, and because of contradictory testimony by various witnesses he was exonerated. The Petzoldts then left India shortly thereafter, as did both Mr. and Mrs. Rimston, who went back to their home in California. Ironically, one of the reasons the Petzoldts were able to travel back to America was because of satsangis, followers, of Sawan Singh, or even the Guru himself, who provided them with a ticket. As Paul Petzoldt confesses, "As far as I know, that's where our ticket came from, where we had the money to buy our ticket and also go down by train down to the island of Ceylon, where we had arranged to catch a Japanese boat going to Europe. We were so relieved for getting out of India, and I was very anxious that my wife see Europe before she came back to America. We were given extra money beside enough money to buy our tickets for travel, and we thought we deserved it. As far as I know, the money which we were given, which we were told we did not have to pay back, came directly or indirectly from the Bayas cult. In addition to that, they presented my wife, who they said had suffered a great deal by this ordeal, a heavy gold bracelet, which was pure gold. Paul further implies that Beas did this because, quote, the cult was somewhat ashamed for this frame-up, which was probably initiated by Mrs. Johnson, end quote. Naturally, those siding with Beas may argue that what Petzoldt and his team viewed as a setup was quite the opposite, since they didn't want him tried on murder charges but on something much less. Furthermore, after Paul was arraigned, he concedes that higher-ups at Radhaswamy, quote, started to protect me. I know of one person was assigned to sort of keep track of us when we left our buildings and went out on our bicycles, end quote. In one scary incident, Petzoldt reveals how a Beas operative, reportedly acting on behalf of Sawan Singh and or higher-ups from Radhaswamy, actually saved him and his wife from an angry mob near the Golden Temple in Amritsar. And this, too, after Johnson had been killed. Throughout the ordeal, Paul Petzoldt doesn't reveal much remorse about his part in Johnson's death, mostly blaming the doctor's old age and hardened arteries for why he succumbed so quickly after the fall. Petzoldt appears much more traumatized by his own legal troubles than anything else. In various correspondences, he consistently blames others for his monetary woes, including his climbing partners on K2. William P. House, who was on the 1938 Himalayan expedition, doesn't mince words when speaking of Paul Petzoldt's disposition in an interview on September 14, 1995. He's a great man, but the defects of his character are somewhat serious. House, along with two other mountaineers, including Charles Houston, was contacted by the American authorities in India to supply a significant sum of money to secure Paul Petzoldt's release from jail and eventual return to America. As House remembers, the ambassador contacted Charlie, Bob, and myself and said if we could get Paul out of India quickly, the charges would be dismissed and he wouldn't be kept in jail. We got together $700, which was a lot of money in those days. Footnote: $700 in 1939 would be nearly $12,000 in 2016. End footnote. And cabled it over to the consul, and the consul got Paul and his wife, Bernice, Patricia, back to this country. Well, he never repaid it. Footnote: when asked specifically about this loan from his friends, Paul Petzoldt claims that he never received it, which, under the circumstances, seems a bit odd, given how insistent the American consul had been about obtaining it to secure Petzoldt's release. End footnote. This is one of the reasons that we all have reservations about Paul. He not only didn't repay it, but in the course of our expedition, we incurred a number of expenses and we gave a large number of lectures after this to pay our debts. We had 2 sets of movies, one of which Paul had, and he gave lectures throughout the West. They were pretty good movies, the first of the area, and colored movies that came out well. He took many of them. We provided the film. Anyway, none of this ever got back to us. Paul kept everything. Though his climbing partners on K2 had great respect for Paul Petzoldt's climbing ability, they felt that he tended to take too much credit for what he achieved. As House ruefully recalls, on the front of a book about our expedition, Paul wrote, in effect, the route I found on K2. He didn't acknowledge that it was a joint effort that we all shared. House felt that Petzoldt was intimidated by his partners from the eastern United States because he came from rather simple circumstances, and coming up against these 3 wealthy Easterners, he probably was scared of us. He had no reason to be insecure, but I think he was. Even a longtime admirer of Paul Petzoldt, such as Molly Absalon, has diffident feelings about his personality. Nonetheless, I get the impression that Paul's ego is bruised by people speaking badly of him, and the controversy surrounding some of his decisions or actions in the past wounds him. During my interview with Paul, I found myself drawn into an argument with him over the disposal of human waste in the wilderness that illuminated the brash side of his character for me. I was infuriated by him as we debated the details of cat holes. I felt he tricked me and manipulated the conversation. He seemed argumentative, difficult, and unfair. But when I listened to our conversations on tapes later, it dawned on me that Paul was baiting me for the love of the fight, not because he personally wanted to anger me or really wanted to spend time discussing feces. In fact, I think he would be surprised to know how upset I was about the exchange. He says that he is not opinionated, that he is a compromiser. His inflammatory statements are for effect, but he doesn't seem to recognize that the effect can, and has at times, backfire on him. This partial analysis, even if dated, provides us with a bit more context about why someone like Elizabeth Bruce may have taken such umbrage at Paul Petzoldt, even if it doesn't justify her own reaction to him. Further questions. In going over what happened on January 25, 1939, one cannot help but have nagging questions about the incident, particularly when there is no clear-cut and unambiguous retelling. For instance, if there was indeed a struggle over the shotgun as has been claimed, why were Bhagat Singh and Elliot attacking Paul Petzoldt and not Elizabeth Bruce, who first brought out the gun? Why the impasse until Paul struggled for it himself? Were the Dera residents more frightened by what Paul might do with the gun than Elizabeth Bruce? In the book On Top of the World, Bhagat Singh explains why he jumped on Paul's back versus Elizabeth's when the fight ensued, providing suggestive evidence that perhaps the Dera residents were more scared of Paul than Elizabeth Bruce.
Paul said, "But why did you jump on my back tonight?"
The Indian attorney batted his eyes and looked suspiciously about him.
"It was for the best," he explained in a soft voice. "You see, if you had gotten the gun, you might have killed us all. Mrs. Barker,
Elizabeth Bruce,
cannot shoot. I have seen her try to shoot the mad dogs, and she cannot. She misses."
Even here, Patricia's narrative is amended by her husband, who alleges in an interview with Ray Ringholtz that only he shot the rabid dogs that would, on occasion, intrude upon the colony. "I had this shotgun, which was given to me by the head of this group. We kept it loaded at all times, because they had outbreaks of rabid dogs. Nobody there would shoot them because they have to take their karma, so he didn't have anybody to shoot the dogs. That was in the dining room to the corner. A double-barreled shotgun loaded all the time. If someone reported one, rabid dog, I'd grab that and run out and shoot them." Given Petzoldt's own claim that the shotgun was his, and that he was the only one willing to shoot virulent dogs, it lends credence to why Donald Elliot, Bhagat Singh, and possibly Dr. Johnson tried to wrestle the gun away from Paul Petzoldt, since he, not Elizabeth Bruce, actually knew how to shoot and kill. This, of course, doesn't exonerate Elizabeth Bruce, but it does better explain why the Dera residents may have feared Paul Petzoldt, who was much younger, much stronger, and much more skilled with weaponry than they were. In other words, fear seems to have been a motivating factor all around, including Paul, who believed that Elizabeth Bruce was going to shoot him. Why Bhagat Singh and others, just hours after Johnson's death, decided to gloss over what really happened is a question that has several answers, but lacking Singh's own documented testimony, we are severely limited in determining for sure the reasoning behind it. The most cynical interpretation, and one that Paul Petzoldt and others on his defense contend is true, focuses on Bhagat Singh's desire to avoid undesirable publicity about Dr. Johnson's death and thus tarnish, at least to some degree, the reputation of the Dera and its spiritual guru, Sawan Singh. Paul Petzoldt's February 4th letter to mountaineer Charles Houston, just 9 days after Johnson's demise, unequivocally blames the Dera for putting him in a catch-22 situation. "With the help of a local Indian lawyer, they fixed things with the local police. The object being to avoid mentioning the gun and the fact that Miss Bruce was trying to shoot me and to protect themselves in general. They fabricated an entire new story about the affair and came to me saying that unless I told the story, they make a very bad case against me. Knowing the corruption that exists in Indian lawyers, and being without funds to fight the case, and realizing I had little chance with so many against me, I could do nothing except to agree to their fabricated version of the accident." The concocted version from Bhagat Singh and others saved Petzoldt from the more serious charge of murder since, as he admits, "Their police story showed I'd struck Dr. Johnson without any provocation, and the post-mortem had saved me from a more serious charge." Petzoldt had specifically written Houston because "I have no money to pay the fine, and no means of taking care of Mrs. Petzoldt if I receive a small sentence. At the time I wired you, I did not know what would happen." While the supposed fabrication provided Petzoldt with a much less serious charge, simple hurt, it still rankled because he was facing jail time and a fine. It appears that when Paul and his wife received advice outside of the Dera circle, he realized that pleading guilty, even to manslaughter, was a mistake, given that he never intended to hurt Dr. Johnson in the first place, and only ended up hitting, or colliding, depending on which version we believe, his friend in order to avoid getting shot by Elizabeth Bruce. Naturally, those wanting a more positive interpretation of Bhagat Singh and the Dera may argue that he was trying to accomplish two things at once: saving Petzoldt from a devastating murder indictment and saving Radhaswamy from bad press. In this scenario, it wasn't so much a conspiracy to frame Petzoldt as it was to have the ugly situation go away as quickly as possible, even if that meant whitewashing away vital specifics. The one person's reputation that shines brighter here is Dr. Julian Johnson's, since he was regarded with warm regard by all sides, including Paul Petzoldt, who felt he was a good friend, and Patricia Petzoldt, who, quote, liked the old man because he lets me be myself, end quote. As for Sawan Singh, he is not overtly mentioned as being involved in the proceedings, except that he is reported to have provided protection for the Petzolds and also to arrange sufficient funds for their eventual departure. Even after being arraigned on murder charges, later to be changed, Paul wanted his wife to see Sawan Singh because, I thought you would be safer. Patricia did feel better, and conceded, contrary to her earlier impressions, that, quote, these people have been very kind, all of them. The aftermath. Elizabeth Bruce, who later suffered from a severe case of dysentery, died just a few years after her husband's death. Bhagat Singh never did succeed his guru Sawan Singh at Beas, as he died in early January 1946. His cousin Jagat would, however, in 1948. The spiritual head of Radhaswami Satsang Beas, Sawan Singh, died in his 90th year on April 2, 1948. Paul Petzoldt would survive them all by more than 4 decades. Patricia Petzoldt and her husband eventually divorced. Their relationship became so acrimonious at one point that Paul accused his wife of trying to kill him. In the book Teaching Adventure Education Theory by Bob Stremba, which contains a biographical portrait of Paul Petzoldt, Paul alleges that, quote, one evening he woke up from his sleep and discovered Bernice, Patricia, standing above him with a large piece of wood in her hands, ready to hit him on the head. He escaped, but felt that Bernice needed medical attention. End quote. Paul would marry 3 more times, with 2 wives leaving him because of his adventurous and unstable lifestyle. Paul Petzoldt considered his involvement with the death of Julian Johnson to be the worst humiliation of his life because so many false rumors cropped up concerning it. Some publications even suggested that he murdered Dr. Johnson and was never allowed to set foot in India again. As Petzoldt recalls, quote, this has been the tragedy of my life because rumors were circulated all during this time, that I was guilty of murder in India and had been kicked out of India and told never to return. Footnote. The rumor that Dr. Johnson had been murdered is a persistent one, and the story has been retold more than once by other cult leaders as a not-so-subtle form of intimidation. I recall a former follower of Eckankar telling me that a higher-up in the organization told him the story about Julian Johnson being murdered, saying words to the effect that, you don't want to end up like Johnson, do you? John Roger Hinkins, the late founder of MSIA, also informed me that he believed Julian Johnson was consciously murdered. The available evidence provided by the Dera and those defending Paul Petzoldt suggest nothing of the sort. End footnote. Such rumors also prevented Petzoldt from climbing K2 again. As the book Ghosts of K2 explains, quote, the peculiar circumstances of Mr. Johnson's death and the sensational reporting that ensued did nothing for his, Paul Petzoldt's, reputation. Rumors circulated that he was persona non grata in India and would be rearrested if he ever tried to go back. Having climbed higher than anyone else on K2, he could have been a real asset on future climbs, but after the court case, there was never any serious chance that he might return to K2. End quote. It is indeed disconcerting to see how many books and articles inaccurately report the death of Julian Johnson and Paul Petzoldt's role in it. For instance, Ed Vesters and David Roberts, in their book on K2, point out that, quote, in the 1960s, in climbing circles, the scuttlebutt told an utterly different story. In this version, Petzoldt had ended up in a fistfight with a porter on some sort of trek and had killed him with a single blow to the head. Like most Wyoming cowboys, Petzoldt had honed his skills as a brawler and bar fighter. The climbing gossip had it that Petzoldt was allowed to leave India only after promising they would never return to the country. End quote. As Molly Absalon insightfully points out, somehow time has warped this story. Rumors continue to float around that Paul murdered someone in a duel in India, and although he was let off, he was forced out of the country and told he could never return. Paul shakes his head as I recount these stories. He knows such rumors are out there, but he is hurt by their viciousness and has trouble understanding the source of the malice. I don't know where they got the idea that I wasn't allowed back in India. I know it said that in some book that was written by 2 guys about climbing in the Himalayas. I wrote to one of them and asked where he got that information. He wouldn't tell me. Instead, he wrote back apologizing and saying, please don't sue me. Paul sighs. I don't know what to do about it because the rumor is spread. People think that this is why I'm not in the Alpine Club. The reason I am not in the Alpine Club, the American Alpine Club, is because when I went out west, I had no reason to belong. It cost money, and I wasn't getting anything out of it. Outside of his numerable mountaineering achievements, Paul Petzoldt became most famous for establishing NOLS, the National Outdoor Leadership School in 1965 in Sinks Canyon, Wyoming. During his long life, Paul Petzoldt held a variety of jobs. He has been a restaurateur, a used car salesman, an author, a military advisor, a Lend-Lease agent, a climbing guide, a student, a Himalayan mountaineer, a wheat farmer, a sheep herder, a professional poker player, a ski racer, an outward bound instructor, and the founder of the National Outdoor Leadership School and the Wilderness Education Association. Yet Paul Petzoldt's involvement with his friend Dr. Johnson's death haunted him for his entire life. The rumors and insinuations got to him emotionally. As Molly Absalon explains, "Today Paul is a lifetime member in good standing in the American Alpine Club, but the fact that there are still rumors asserting he was ousted bothers him. Paul's sensitivity is somewhat surprising in so outspoken a man. He is notorious among those who worked under him at NOLS for his direct way of handling others, abruptly firing and then rehiring instructors for everything from forgetting their ski poles on a course to wearing long hair was his style of management. If you allowed your ego to be bruised by his bombastic rhetoric, your career at the school was limited. Nonetheless, I get the impression that Paul's ego is bruised by people speaking badly of him, and the controversy surrounding some of his decisions or actions in the past wounds him." Although he mended his friendship with his 1938 K2 mountaineering comrades, there were still underlying feelings of resentment on both sides that were never resolved. 60 years after Dr. Julian P. Johnson's unfortunate death on January 25, 1939, Paul Petzoldt died of prostate cancer at the age of 91 on October 6, 1999. Postscript: A mystical encounter. In researching this book, I was wonderstruck to discover that Paul Petzoldt described having a mystical experience while meditating at the Dera in India. Even after all the turmoil he went through, Paul felt that his experience was more profound than alcohol, drugs, or even mountain climbing. He has provided several descriptions of it, but the following is the most complete. This particular group, Radhaswami Satsang Bayas, didn't have any special breathing, etc. This breathing is not necessarily concentration. Concentration, as they, satsangis, talked about it, is throwing your mind in a complete blank. These people, meditators doing Shabad yoga, seem to all go off in the same sort of thing. I wondered why this happened. At first I didn't think it was happening. I thought maybe here was 100,000 people pretending, but I'm sure that they weren't pretending. After people, meditators, become good at it, they could do it in no time at all. I had this experience and went off had lots of sort of nice experiences in beautiful lands. I had a preconceived idea in my mind of a sort of Shangri-La place. So that's what I sort of went through. But this doctor, Julian Johnson, I think what you do is what you're supposed to or what you've oriented yourself to do beforehand. And although these people were not supposed to talk about their experience, this was a no-no, it was commonly known what sort of experiences they went through. They would go into this beautiful land where there were no problems or nothing, and they would talk with the master. What the old doctor would do is what he said, he told me. He was a great philosopher and extremely intelligent. He'd go there and here was the whole gang. There was Jesus Christ, Confucius, Muhammad, the whole bunch of them, Plato, Aristotle, his whole gang. They'd talk about things. When I went into a trance, I was sort of floating around in this beautiful land with the most pleasant sensation. Much more pleasant than anything I've ever had before or since. Sex, marijuana. I smoked once when I was in college in the 1930s. Nice alcoholic glows that I've had, standing on top of mountains, moments of triumph, any of those high spots never compared. I've been ill at times, had a car wreck one time where I had to take some opiates of some kind, and this was a nice, warm, cozy feeling, but nothing compared. It was beautiful, good, just a complete release and something you wanted to do again. You would naturally bring yourself out of it. It wouldn't last very long at first. Some of these people could do it for hours. I stopped because I was afraid of it. I could get hooked on this. This was something terrific. Paul Petzoldt's mystical excursion is remarkable for a man who considers himself skeptical of any and all religious superstitions. While at the Dera, Petzoldt appears to have been instructed on how to do Shabad yoga meditation, which was the central practice of Radhaswamis at Beas. Sawan Singh was regarded as a master of the technique, and would instruct new initiates on how to see inner light and hear inner sound. It is intriguing that Petzoldt would mention how Dr. Johnson during his spiritual journeys would see religious and philosophical luminaries. There exists one letter from Dr. Johnson where he describes meeting Jesus and talking with him. It is an odd letter since it contains questionable information about Jesus, and it is most likely for this reason that it has never been published by Beas. I have included a partial transcript of it in the appendices. Footnote: Shabad yoga meditational experiences are similar in many ways to near-death experiences, where one feels they are leaving their body, going through a dark tunnel, seeing a brilliant light, and sometimes hearing beautiful music. Indeed, Radhaswami literature advertises their meditation technique as a conscious and safe way of, quote, dying while living, in order to explore higher levels of awareness. It seems fairly evident that NDEs and Shabad yoga meditation experiences are circumscribed by one's personal and social background, since Christians who have NDEs tend to see Jesus and not the multiple arms of Shiva, the destroyer god in Hinduism. Baba Fakir Chand, a radical guru in the Radhaswami tradition, believes that all such religious visions are projections of one's own consciousness. See the book The Unknowing Sage, 1981, for a deeper discussion on this controversial subject. End footnote. I am not quite sure what to make of Paul Petzoldt's mystical voyage, but it is telling that he regarded it as the most pleasant of all his experiences, even greater than his mountaineering accomplishments. Dr. Johnson never got the chance to see his final published book, The Path of the Masters, become internationally known and extremely influential in drawing seekers to Radhaswami and Shabad yoga. Today the book is still in print and has gone through many editions. It has also received the dubious distinction of being one of the most plagiarized spiritual books in the past 50 years. Footnote: The most famous example is Paul Petzoldt, the founder of Eckankar, who plagiarized large chunks from Julian Johnson's The Path of the Masters and With a Great Master in India in many of his writings. Twitchell's literary borrowing from Johnson is so extensive in his 1970 book, The Far Country, that years later, Eckankar withdrew it from circulation. End footnote. Johnson's books have influenced thousands around the world and are still being widely read today. Paul Petzoldt, too, has impacted thousands through his wilderness educational programs, allowing young men and women in North America and elsewhere to become better trained stewards of the mountains, deserts, and oceans. Tragically, Paul Petzoldt deeply admired Dr. Julian Philip Johnson and never intended to kill him. He considered him a friend and a mentor. A simple argument evolved into something much worse and created a mystery that still haunts the memories of all those involved. Appendix 1. C. E. Macy, American Consul, Memorandum. Memorandum concerning protection case involving Paul Petzoldt and wife. On the evening of February 4th, 1939, shortly before departure from Karachi to go to Lahore in connection with service there as commissioner to take testimony on open commission in the case of Mrs. Lemma Holmes Smith versus Carl Holmes, see Exchange of Telegrams dated Karachi, January 17th, 1 p.m., and Washington, January 18th, 7 p.m. Also, dispatch number 161 of April 1st, 1939. The following telegram was received from the Consulate General at Calcutta. Would appreciate your interviewing Paul Petzoldt, American, care Thomas Cook, Lahore. The Civil and Military Gazette of Lahore and the Delhi Statesman, in their issues of February 3rd, had both carried an item relating to this young man and his difficulties, enclosure number 1A. Dr. Johnson, the deceased, had been registered at the consulate since 1937, but was not known to the staff. Included in his registration was his wife, Mrs. Elizabeth Bruce Johnson. Dr. Johnson, said to be a retired physician and surgeon who had formerly practiced at or near Sutter City, California. He was reported to have come to India on or about the year 1932, where he had embraced the Radhaswami faith, basically Hindu, and later married on July 10th, 1934, according to Hindu rites, in India, Miss Elizabeth Bruce, who was said to have been born in San Francisco, California, on April 19, 1894. After taking up residence at Dera Baba Jamal Singh, Dr. Johnson had established a charitable hospital, clinic, and dispensary there. His wife, Mrs. Elizabeth Bruce Johnson, a herbalist and licentiate in medicine, was serving with him as a nurse and was also compounding for sale a line of face creams and cosmetics made from India herbs. The Radhaswami sect has two main divisions, one with headquarters at Agra and the other with headquarters at Dera Baba Jamal Singh. One of its tenets is understood to be a requirement that members shall place all their money or earnings in a common fund eat the same food together at a common table, etc. It may be that the foregoing is not exactly correct, but at any rate, members are at least required to tithe strongly, and further, the colony works on communal or collective basis, with everyone supposed to contribute to a common fund, and to follow without questioning the teachings of the master or the spiritual head of the sect. The head priest or guru is at present S. Sawan Singh. Dera Baba Jamal Singh, where the Radhaswami temple is located, is about 5 miles from the railway station of Beas, which is about 20 miles distant from Amritsar, Punjab, on the main trunk line leading to Jalandhar and Delhi. Shortly after arrival at Lahore, on the evening of February 5th, the writer telephoned to Messrs. Thomas Cook and Sons, who reported that they did not know Mr. Petzoldt's whereabouts. That, in accordance with his instructions, they merely held his mail until he called for it. They were requested to leave a note in his box, asking him to call at Folletti's Hotel. On or about 1 p.m. on February 7th, Mr. and Mrs. Petzoldt called at the hotel. Both appeared to be very upset, despondent, and worried. Petzoldt executed an affidavit giving a chronological account of his movements in India, from the time of his arrival with the K2 expedition up to the time the death of Dr. Johnson occurred, January 25, 1939. 2 copies of this affidavit, which was finally typed and ready for Mr. Petzoldt's signature on February 8, 1939, are attached. Enclosure number 2A. After securing Mr. Petzoldt's statement, a telegram was then sent to the Consulate General at Calcutta, which read as follows.
No murder motive. Petzoldt case. Merely tragic accident. Resulting scuffle. Ill-advised. Pleaded guilty. Stop. Are 2 young Americans in trouble. Not entirely their fault. Stop. Urgently recommend friends extend financial aid. Stop. Please cable Loomis, care Houston, 50 Haven Avenue, New York. Extremely urgent. Provide sufficient funds for immediate repatriation. Petzoldt and wife. Stop. If you can get assurance these funds forthcoming, believe can move government successfully suspension sentence upon assurance leave India at once. Stop. Mailing affidavit.
In connection with the penultimate sentence in the above, it should be explained that before meeting Mr. Petzoldt, the writer had already interviewed the Home Secretary of the Punjab government, Mr. A.V. Asquith, who had shown him the preliminary police report on the case, and had also telephoned the district magistrate at Amritsar, who confirmed the fact that the accused had pleaded guilty to a charge of simple hurt after having been originally booked on a charge of culpable homicide. This charge of simple hurt to which Petzoldt had pleaded guilty carried a maximum sentence of 1 year's imprisonment, a fine of rupees 1,000, or both. The main difficulty was, of course, lack of funds to work with. The second difficulty was that even though Petzoldt's statements in his affidavit about what happened at Dera Baba Jamal Singh on the evening of January 25, 1939, might be accepted as correct, his plea of guilty had more or less effectively stopped any effort in court to help him. For, of course, an appeal cannot be made from a sentence imposed following a plea of guilty. All that can be done is to apply for a reduction of the sentence imposed. The third difficulty was that even though by some means, not then apparent, opportunity might be given in court to argue the case on its merits, bringing in the story about the gun in Mrs. Johnson's hands, at that late date by Petzoldt alone, with no corroborative evidence, would not be particularly effective. It would appear to be merely a concocted tale thought up by Petzoldt after he had seen either his attorney or the consul. Another difficulty was that, tied up as he was at Lahore in connection with work on the commission, for which he was being paid $1 an hour, the writer could not, for lack of time, appear in the Amritsar courtroom as an observer. Under these conditions, the outlook seemed rather hopeless. But at a dinner party given on the night of February 7th, at the home of the Chief Justice at Lahore, Sir Douglas Young, one of the American attorneys present for the commission, Mr. A. E. Chambers, at the risk of boring all concerned, related the whole tale to the Chief Justice, who kindly offered to send a note to a leading Lahore attorney, Mr. Bhagat Ram, suggesting that he call and see the writer at his hotel. The next day, February 8th, Mr. Bhagat Ram called and said he would be glad to take the case. The writer gave him 200 rupees plus 15 rupees for expenses to proceed to Amritsar, and told him, in Petzoldt's presence, that if the fine imposed was not more than 200 rupees, to pay it. If it was more, or if a prison sentence was imposed, to report back, and it would then be seen what could be done. Further assurance was given Mr. Petzoldt that if he should be sent to jail, some arrangement to take care of his wife would be worked out, as obviously neither of them could return to Dera Baba Jamal Singh to live, even though their baggage and personal effects were still there. On the evening of February 9th, Messrs. Petzoldt and Bhagat Ram came back to Lahore together and reported that the magistrate had finally ceded to Bhagat Ram's pleadings and arguments, and had permitted Petzoldt to change his plea to one of not guilty. This was a bombshell in the opposition's camp, whose observers in the courtroom immediately sent messengers out to report developments to the headquarters at Dera Baba Jamal Singh. Hearing for cross-examination of prosecution's witnesses was set for Saturday, February 11th, and the accused continued free on bail furnished by an Indian member of the Radhaswami sect, one Mr. Saini of the family of Saini brothers, electrical contractors, Mahajit Bazar, Kapurthala. The question then arose as to what should be done about securing the couple's baggage and effects from their former lodgings at Dera Baba Jamal Singh. Mr. and Mrs. Petzoldt were informed that the hearings of the commission might be adjourned the next day, 10th, and, if so, the writer could proceed to Dera Baba Jamal Singh by motor car and take Mrs. Petzoldt with him, that while he was looking over the scene of the drama and talking to the other Americans there, she could get her things together and have them put in the car. The Petzoldts left the hotel that evening, with the understanding that this procedure would be followed. However, a note received from Mr. Petzoldt early the next morning, 10th, reported that the couple were leaving for Beas on an early train and would slip into Dera Baba Jamal Singh quietly, get their things, and leave at once. The writer was free from other work by noon of the 10th, and left at once by motor for Dera Baba Jamal Singh. When he arrived there, he found Mrs. Johnson, the widow, Mr. and Mrs. Harry L. Rimston, and David Elliott, all Americans residing in the colony where the quarrel had taken place. They were all very much upset. Discreet questioning brought out quickly that the story told at the trial had been a concocted one, but those concerned persisted in asserting that they had told it with the best of motives, i.e. to save Petzoldt from being indicted for murder. It was brought out that a gun had been brandished, as Petzoldt asserted, but Mrs. Johnson kept reiterating that the weapon was not loaded. The writer's definite impression was, after having talked with the Americans in the Radhaswami colony at Dera Baba Jamal Singh, that Mrs. Johnson was in complete control of everything said or done there. It was especially evident that the elderly gentleman, Donald Elliott, was under her influence and apparently afraid of her. Elliott was the man who, in the story first told in the court, was the person whose interference to protect Dr. Johnson from Petzoldt's attack so infuriated Petzoldt that he took a swing at Elliott, but missing him when the latter ducked, the blow struck Dr. Johnson full in the face and knocked him down, the back of his head striking the concrete door sill as he fell. Mrs. Rimston, who, with her husband, were comparatively new arrivals in the colony, was not found with the other Americans. She was reported to have a severe headache, but it seemed quite apparent that she was in the ill graces of Mrs. Johnson for the same reason that the Petzoldts had been, namely refusal, or at least disinclination, to wholeheartedly embrace the tenets of the sect, and particularly to fully subscribe to the principle of donating everything to the common fund. After some maneuvering, Mr. Rimston was taken away from the others on the excuse that the writer wanted to see the quarters where the Petzoldts had been living, which was in the same building Mr. and Mrs. Rimston were staying. Mrs. Rimston, as expected, was found to be suffering principally from boredom. Rimston was told that while the principles of the sect might be well worthy living up to by persons past the prime of life, such as Elliott, who had apparently embraced the faith as an escape from a life of frustration, it hardly seemed worthwhile for a young American couple to throw away their future in Indian religious immolation. Rimston, and particularly his wife, seemed to heartily agree. He seemed worried, however, about how he could change the story without subjecting himself to the pains and penalties of perjury. He was not told what he should say, but it seemed apparent that he was receptive to the suggestion given him that, upon cross-examination, he should simply tell the truth, no matter whom it hurt or whatever might be the consequences. Further investigation in the colony after leaving the Americans convinced the writer that what had probably happened was about this: that Bhagat Singh, the public prosecutor at Jalandhar, and whose car brought the doctor from Jalandhar the night of Dr. Johnson's untimely death, had concocted a story for all concerned to tell. His reason for so doing was that, as he is slated to be the next guru, or spiritual head of the sect, one of whose main tenets is peace and passive resistance if attacked, he could see no good whatever for the colony in the scandal and publicity which news of Mrs. Johnson having brandished a gun in the quarrel with other inmates would cause. Therefore, in connivance with the head, or at least some high official at the Beas police station, a story had been concocted. And as all the witnesses told the same story, when the Criminal Investigation Department operatives from Amritsar arrived at Dera Baba Jamal Singh on or about 3 o'clock p.m. on the afternoon of January 26th, some 15 hours after Dr. Johnson's demise, the police had no reason to smell a rat. The writer returned to Lahore from Beas at 9 p.m. on the night of February 10th, and immediately conferred with Petzoldt, giving a memorandum of the day's developments for his own and Mr. Bhagat Ram's information. The case dragged along until March 10th, Mr. Bhagat Ram having to make some 8 trips to Amritsar from Lahore before Petzoldt was finally acquitted. A copy of Bhagat Ram's last letter to the writer in the case, dated Lahore, March 10th, 1939, is attached. Enclosure number 3A. In usual course, this attorney's fees for a case of this kind would have been around 1,500 rupees, but he accepted willingly under the circumstances the 200 rupees originally advanced to him on February 8th to pay Petzoldt's fine. This amount was originally paid out of the writer's own pocket, but later Messrs. Chambers and Shulman, two of the American attorneys temporarily in Lahore in connection with the Commission's work, donated 100 rupees each, for which grateful acknowledgement is made. Mr. Bhagat Ram gave the case his best attention and was even willing to accept no pay at all for his services. Under the circumstances, however, this hardly seemed advisable. In conclusion, there remains but one other point, and that is the manner in which funds for the repatriation of Mr. and Mrs. Petzoldt were obtained. Through Mr. Charles Houston, leader of the K2 expedition of the American Alpine Club, the members of that expedition guaranteed the cost of return steamer passage for the couple and telegraphed to Consul Groth at Calcutta $550 to be used for that purpose. These arrangements were made through direct exchange of telegrams between Consul Edward M. Groth at Calcutta and Mr. Charles S. Houston, 50 Haven Avenue, New York, New York. It is understood that Messrs. Groth and Houston are personal friends. Mr. and Mrs. Petzoldt, it is understood, sailed from Colombo en route to the United States on the SS Cassima Maru of the NYK line on or about March 21st, 1939. It is understood that Mr. and Mrs. Rimston have left the colony also and returned to their home in California. This leaves only Mrs. Johnson and the elderly Mr. Elliot in the colony at present. Mrs. Johnson was unable to find her passport at the time of the visit to the colony, but Mr. Elliot is the holder of and exhibited American passport number 32382, dated Washington, D.C., November 15, 1937. His brother, Joseph Johnson, is reported to be living in Gridley, California at the present time. The United States addresses of the two American attorneys, who donated 100 rupees each to pay the cost of legal counsel to represent Petzoldt in the District Magistrate's Court at Amritsar, are as follows. 1. Mr. John Shulman, Hayes, St. John, Abramson and Shulman, 120 Broadway, New York, New York. And 2. Mr. Ambrose E. Chambers, 84 William Street, New York, New York, also 9 Rue Boissy d'Anglais, Paris, France. C. E. Macy, American Consul, Karachi, India, April 3, 1939. Enclosures 1A. Press clipping in duplicate. 2A. Affidavit of Paul Petzoldt in duplicate. 3A. Letter from Bhagat Ram, dated Lahore, March 9, 1939. Appendix 2. Letter from American Consul to Charles Houston. File number 310. American Consular Service, Calcutta, India, February 6, 1939. Department of State, Airmail. Dear Houston, yesterday I received your cable regarding Paul Petzoldt's difficulties. The day before your message arrived, we received a long letter from him giving the details of his unfortunate experience. We telegraphed him at once in care of Cooks in Lahore, telling him to get in touch with Macy, our consul at Karachi, who happily is due in Lahore this morning to attend to some official business there. We also wired Macy at Karachi, which message may have reached him before he left for Lahore, that we were anxious for him to establish contact with Petzoldt. It happens that Lahore is in the Karachi consular district, so Macy is the man with whom Petzoldt should discuss his case. In his letter, Petzoldt said that he had arranged to secure sufficient funds to pay the fine, which he believed would be levied as a result of the court's judgment. He also indicated that he had cabled to the United States for money to pay his return passage. I surmised that he might have cabled you, and apparently this is what he did do. I do not know what the original arrangements were in regard to defraying transportation costs of your expedition, but imagine that expedition members were all provided with return transportation. You may remember having written me that Petzoldt was not returning with you all, and that I should be on the lookout for him in Calcutta, which he eventually expected to pass through, en route to the United States. While in Srinagar, I learned that Petzoldt had become interested in things occult, and that he had decided to spend some time at Beas, near Kapurthala, where there was said to reside a very learned seer. I also learned that he was staying there with the late Dr. Johnson. I wanted to write to him at the time and suggest that he be sure to look me up in passing through Calcutta, for I was interested to learn what his reaction might be to what he found at Beas, as I was also somewhat interested in learning more of yogic activities. My intention to write Mr. Petzoldt was never carried out, and on my return here, I inquired whether he had called during my absence. Apparently he had not. Addressed to Charles S. Houston, Esquire, 50 Haven Avenue, New York City. Appendix 3. Letter from Mr. Groth to C. Houston. File number 804. American Consular Service, Calcutta, India, February 8, 1939. Department of State Airmail. Dear Houston, I have just wired you as per enclosed copy, and hope that it will be possible for Loomis to supply the necessary funds for the repatriation of the Petzoldts. My telegram was sent on the basis of a wire received a few minutes ago from my Karachi colleague Macy, who is at present in Lahore, and with whom Petzoldt has now been able to establish contact. It is most unfortunate that Petzoldt was so ill-advised as to plead guilty in this particular case. After all, Dr. Johnson's death was the cause of an accident and not as a result of any murder motive on Petzoldt's part. Certainly, the trouble in which these two young Americans find themselves is not entirely their fault. The last communication we had from Petzoldt said that he would have to pay the fine of 1,000 rupees on February 9th, but I think through Macy's representations, that date can probably be postponed until such time as we receive a reply from you. Petzoldt had asked that I wire Loomis in your care, but to reduce cable charges, and also because the only communication we've had from New York was signed by you, it seemed best to wire you direct. Macy seemed optimistic in his telegram that he would be successful in moving the government to suspend the sentence if assurances could be given that Petzoldt and his wife would leave India immediately. I am now awaiting Petzoldt's affidavit in regard to the whole matter, which is being forwarded by mail. I feel sorry for these young people, for India is an extremely bad place in which to become involved in difficulties of this sort. But I am cheered by the fact that Macy is in Lahore, for he is a very capable officer, and I know will do everything he can to aid your friends. Sincerely yours, Edward M. Groth. Appendix 3B. Second letter from Mr. Groth to C. Houston. In reply, refer to file number EWG-EWP. The Foreign Service of the United States of America, American Consulate General, Calcutta, April 11th, 1939. Dear Houston, this morning there was placed on my desk a communication addressed by my colleague at Karachi to the State Department, under cover of which there was transmitted a memorandum concerning the Petzoldt case. I am having a copy of that memo struck off and transmitting it herewith for your information, for I feel that the details given therein will enable you, in far better fashion than has yet been possible, to visualize the complexity of this case. I am sure you will also appreciate how fortunate it was that Macy happened to be in Karachi when the Petzoldt case broke. If he had been at his post, the chances are that Petzoldt would now be languishing in a stuffy Punjab jail. And let me tell you that would be anything but a pleasant experience. I received a telegram from Weissman this morning, announcing their arrival at Bombay. All seems to be well, and I suppose they are now en route to Srinagar. Sincerely yours, Groth. Enclosure. Copy of Memorandum re Petzoldt case. Addressed to Charles S. Houston, Esquire, 50 Haven Avenue, New York City. Appendix 4. Telegram from Mr. Groth to Loomis. Western Union Cablegram. Please inform Loomis. Extremely urgent sufficient funds be provided forthwith. For immediate repatriation, Petzoldt and wife. Stop. If required money can be guaranteed, sentence may possibly be suspended upon assurance Petzoldt leave India immediately. Groth. The quickest, surest, and safest way to send money is by telegraph or cable. Appendix 5. Letter from Bakshi Bhagat Ram. Enclosure number 3A. Copy. 2 Fan Road, Lahore, March 10th, 1939, 1:18 p.m. Dear Mr. Macy, I have just received your letter on return from the High Court. I should have thought the result was known to you last evening. I received the enclosed telegram from Paul late in the evening. I wired back to him saying, "Delighted innocence vindicated." I am glad I have been able to do my part satisfactorily. In the whole of this particularly spoilt case, when you took over, your efforts to bring out the truth have been considerable. I dare say, but for your visit to Bayos, Remston would not have come out with the truth about the gun, and but for Remston's statement, Mrs. Johnson would never have, though indirectly, acknowledged the gun incident. I can unhesitatingly say that your presence here proved a real help to Petzoldt. I shall come round to see you after 5 p.m. today. With sincerest regards, yours sincerely, Bakshi Bhagat Ram. Appendix 6. Dr. Johnson's letter about meeting Jesus. It appears that a number of letters written by Julian Johnson were informally circulated in the 1930s, and that a number of these have not been formally published. One letter in particular, however, has been widely circulated and discussed in certain Beas and Brahmani Satsangi circles. This is Johnson's controversial November 3, 1936 letter, wherein he describes a remarkable communication with Jesus Christ. The letter, or a copy thereof, was in the possession of Harvey Myers, who was Sawan Singh's representative from the mid-1930s until his death in 1948, and subsequently served as Jagat Singh's and Charan Singh's representative until his death in the 1960s. Copies of this letter were informally circulated amongst satsangis and occasionally used by some to claim that Jesus Christ was only a lower region master and had not yet achieved the highest spiritual realization. The following is an exact photocopy of an alleged transcription of Johnson's letter concerning Jesus. It comes from Banyan Books in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, which at one time housed a treasure trove of information relating to Sawan Singh, Kirpal Singh, and the early history of Radhaswami. In analyzing the following document, I have noticed a number of apparent discrepancies that may be due, at least in part, to how the original letter was transcribed, not the least of which is that Julian Johnson's first name is apparently misspelled as Julien, Julien. The second issue that is troublesome is that on page 2 of the letter, Johnson says that Sawan Singh, Great Master, is in his 68th year, but this is off by 10 years, as he would have been in his 78th year in 1936. One wonders if this is merely a transcription error or a typo in the original. There is also the curious claim by Julian Johnson that Sawan Singh had been leading a strict bachelor life for the past 28 years, suggesting that Sawan turned such in the year 1907 or 1908, an unusual date since he assumed mastership several years before this. Is 28 years also a typo or a transcription error? The letter is full of intriguing details, but how Julian Johnson communicates with Jesus and his description of him is the most questionable and controversial. Johnson doesn't reveal the method for how he contacted Jesus, but one cannot help wondering if some sort of channeling took place, since Johnson alleges that it came about because of the cooperation and help of the Master and 4 others. Johnson also speaks about Sawan Singh intending him to go back to America to carry forth his teachings. What precisely this implies is not clear, as even Johnson doesn't seem sure. In any case, it is a fascinating document that warrants further attention, particularly since it is only a transcription and not the original letter. Johnson Letter.
Punjab, India, November 3rd, 1936. Dear brother and dear sister, I have taken much longer over this promised note than I had intended. My chief difficulty was that I could not describe Father as I would like to. There is no photograph of him which I could send you as a substitute for the description. He has not been photographed so far. One hears so much of idol worship in India, but saints, one and all, have condemned this form of worship. They advocate the worship of the Master within, at the eye focus, for it is that form which remains with the disciple, even after death. The evil practice, however, creeps in sooner or later anyway. The followers, on the account of the weakness of human nature, some during the lifetime of a saint, but generally when he is off the scene. To avoid any possible chance of this practice creeping in, Father preferred not to be photographed at all. On repeated requests from us, mostly in behalf of our sisters and brothers in America, he has been pleased to say, "It will be seen." From this I conclude something will come out. That is my apology for delay. You ask whether Father is an incarnation or an adept. You must have read in the discourses that there is no difference in the spiritual powers of an incarnation and those of an adept. When the method of sound practice becomes extinct in the world, then the Supreme Being sends an incarnation to survive it. An incarnation starts a line of adepts who succeed him one after another and preach the method of sound practice to the world. Thus, Kabir was an incarnation, and the successors in his line were adepts. Guru Nanak was an incarnation, and his successors were adepts. Similarly, in this line, Swamiji was an incarnation, and his successors, including our Father, would be called adepts from the point of view of discourses. I may mention here that if someone says to Father that he is an adept or a guru, or some such thing,
his reply invariably is, "Guru is the Lord," and he would be happy if his saints would only let him sit at their holy feet. Flattery is foreign to his nature. As to his earthly career, he comes from a very respectable family with military traditions. Of Garhwal Jat, Sikhs of Indihiana district in the Punjab, and was subdivisional officer in the military works engineering department. His father and grandfather were commissioned officers in the army. He married at about the age of 25 and has 2 sons who manage the estate at home. For the last 28 years, he has been leading a strictly bachelor life. He retired from government service in 1910, and ever since has been living on his own pension and does not accept any kind of presents from any of his followers. His diet is very simple. It consists of milk, milk products, bread, and vegetables. He goes to bed usually between 11 and 12 o'clock at night, and gets up at 3 a.m. in winter and 6 in summer. He spends the day giving discourses to those who might have come for the purpose, or in study of spiritual books, and in looking after the hermitage. His evenings are given to meditation. His preachings and practices strictly coincide. As to his physical body, he is now in his 68th year, and has a most reverential face with snowy white beard shining on his breast. His eyes have a peculiar luster in them. His personal magnetism attracts everyone who has the privilege of sitting in his company. One cannot pass him by without noticing something new and unusual. It is very fine for you to have the faith that when I return to America, you can and will have a hospital ready for me. I thank you for that hopeful statement. It is all up to the Master what I shall do. But so far as I can gather, he intends for me to return to America to carry on for him as soon as I am ready for it. The best way to carry on, I think, would be to have a little hospital in which I can do my professional work and make my services free to all, letting each one contribute what he may be able to pay, and then do all of this work in the name of the Master, letting the public know it is that way. That will stimulate a lot of inquiry and may bring many to the path. The Master looks for a great many disciples to seek initiation in the near future. The gracious Master has just this morning assigned to me a nice bungalow and enclosure more remote from the noise. It will have shade and some flowers and plants, and has all I need to be quite comfortable. How he knows everything you will see. I went with my servant boy to see this place and also another man. While I was there looking it over, a boy came running to tell me that the Master was coming. He came and asked me if I liked it, and said that I could have the place and he would have it cleaned and put it in order and fixed up any way I liked it. Said later he would build another room on top of it for me to sleep in during hot weather next year. The place is remote from the noise of all the central buildings where I am now. It is the quietest place on the Dera for my meditations. And he said that the gates should be closed and no one allowed to come to my enclosure unless I wanted them. He is a wonderful father. I wish I could tell you all of my experiences since coming here, but I cannot tell it all. I have had enough experience to convert faith into knowledge. Now I know he is a true Master, and this is the path of light and freedom. How thankful I am, no one can tell. And I tell you, big brother, we are mighty fortunate that we have the guiding hand of a true Sat Guru to take us on and up. Very great is our good fortune. Yes, I wish with all my heart you could be here, even for a little while. But I don't see how it can be managed. Maybe some way will be provided in the future. I would never have started out to come here without money, if it had not been that I felt certain that I could earn my way as a doctor after I got here. And my conviction was true. That is just how it is. So far as I see, this may continue indefinitely so long as the Master is pleased to have me here. And he has said that he wanted me to stay until I was ready to take up the work elsewhere, presumably in America. Oh, I must tell you, I had a wonderful communication with Jesus by cooperation and help of the Master and 4 others. The method I cannot explain now, but I will tell you a part of what he said. He is a tall, thin man of fair skin and auburn hair and blue eyes. He was at that time wearing a white blouse and black pants. He told us he was mixed blood, being partly Jew and partly Aryan. I forgot to ask what parent was Aryan, but presumably it was his father, and mother being a Jewess. He said he actually died on the cross, and that neither Jew nor Romans were especially to blame, as that was his appointed way of death, and had to be so. He said his doing many miracles was a mistake. He said now his mother was above him in spiritual development, that Judas was sitting now near him, and other disciples were scattered here and there. He said in the modern Christian churches there was scarcely a remnant of his true teachings. He said that he taught much the same as all the masters of all the ages have taught. Said he learned most of his teaching from internal meditation and not from any others. Said he got some help from others while in India, but he was not here very long, as some reports have it. He said he was secretly married, that Mary, the sister of Lazarus, was his wife, although the fact was not published to the world. He said it never got into history because it was kept a secret. When I asked him if he had any advice to give me, he replied that he could not advise me because I had been initiated by a great guru and was under his directions, that I was already superior to him and would rapidly go to the highest regions. Of course, I take it just as a kind and courteous way of speaking when he said that I was already superior to him, unless he meant possibly that I had superior advantages to him, being connected with a true guru who can take me on up, and being still in the body gives one vastly superior opportunity to travel inwards and upward. They say that 1 minute of meditation in the earthly body is better than 1 year of meditation on any of the intermediate planes. Jesus said his time was spent almost entirely in meditation, and that he was not going to return to earth for any other incarnation. He said that he was not an incarnation of Zoroaster, for that saint was now sitting close to him. So you can see that much of the information we had concerning him had been rather mixed up. He said that much of what was in the New Testament about him was not true. Even the Rosicrucian stories given in the mystic life of Jesus is not much of it true. This was a marvelous opportunity I had. As soon as he was through talking to me, he returned to his devotions in the oriental sitting posture, shifted his legs to 2 or 3 positions, and sat quiet and silent, just like any regular satsang does. I thought it was quite significant when he said his mother was above him now in development. We have a number of women here in satsang now who are above him in the degree of their development. But with all that he is a dear soul, and we must give him our love and our tenderest thoughts and best wishes. No doubt you will have the gracious privilege to see him and talk with him and see the beautiful realm in which he resides now, as you go on in the course of your development. Of course, I cannot see him in his realm now independently. Not yet. I was only helped by the Master and others to enjoy this gracious privilege of communicating with Jesus. But I just had to tell you about it. Use your judgment about telling others about it. They will not believe in its reality, and this is sacred to us. I guess this will be enough for this time. Perhaps too much. Please write me often to tell me all about things as soon as you have any news to write. Get back the little Samdi as soon as you can. Affectionately your brother, Julian P. Johnson. Appendix 7. Obituary of Paul Petzoldt. Excerpted from the New York Times. October 9th, 1999. Paul Petzoldt, a pioneer of American mountaineering and a wilderness educator who founded the National Outdoor Leadership School, died on Wednesday in Topsham, Maine. He was 91 and lived in nearby South Casco, Maine. A rugged individualist who influenced climbing in the United States for much of the 20th century, Mr. Petzoldt said that leadership and judgment could be taught with more technical outdoor skills. In later years, he became a voice for preserving the environment. Paul Keesau Petzoldt was born in Creston, Iowa on January 16, 1908, the last of 9 children. He grew up on a farm in southern Idaho. He was 16 when he set out in cowboy boots with a friend to scale the Grand Teton, a majestic peak 13,766 feet high in northwestern Wyoming that has become a mecca for rock climbers. We did everything wrong, Mr. Petzoldt said, but the ascent established him as a prodigy and planted the seeds of his later interest in creating an outdoor program that stressed safety and preparedness. When he found that tourists in Grand Teton National Park would pay to go up into its mountains, Mr. Petzoldt started a guide service, one of the first in the country. He climbed the Grand Teton more than 300 times until he was well into his 70s. Mr. Petzoldt attended the universities of Idaho, Wyoming, and Utah from 1929 to 1932, but did not earn a degree. Yet he loved to teach, even as a guide. He developed a system of voice signals that mountaineers still use and innovative techniques for moving over snow. When Mr. Petzoldt visited the Alps in 1934, he traversed the Matterhorn and then retraced his route over the 14,701-foot-high summit on the same day. In 1938, Mr. Petzoldt was invited to join an American team reconnoitering a route up K2, the world's second highest mountain, at 28,250 feet, in Pakistan's Karakoram range. He had no real expedition experience, but he was a darn good climber, recalled Mr. Petzoldt's teammate Robert H. Bates, who was the honorary president of the American Alpine Club, which Mr. Petzoldt later joined. Running short of food, the team chose Mr. Petzoldt to rope up with its leader, Charles S. Houston, for a last push. Swapping leads with Dr. Houston, Mr. Petzoldt climbed without supplementary oxygen to 26,000 feet, then a record for American alpinists. Returning home through India, Mr. Petzoldt got into a fracas with an American medical missionary who died after being knocked down. Patricia Petzoldt, the climber's first wife, wrote in her book, On Top of the World, that Mr. Petzoldt was arrested but avoided being jailed. In 1941, Mr. Petzoldt joined other rock climbers to rescue a marooned parachutist who had landed atop Devil's Tower, an 865 feet high, fluted volcanic spire in Wyoming. Once they reached the parachutist, Mr. Petzoldt proposed leading him down while Dick Durrance, who organized the rescue, and the other climbers followed. They descended to find Mr. Petzoldt briefing reporters and photographers in the glare of automobile headlights. The other rescuers had understood that they would talk to reporters together. Petzoldt later maintained that he had waited for the others but had missed them in the dark. Chris Jones wrote in his book, Climbing in North America. Durrance believed that Petzoldt had deliberately rushed ahead to get in front of the cameras. Mr. Petzoldt courted controversy. He did not apologize for profiting from his climbing ventures, encouraging attention from the news media, flirting with women, or twisting arms. Former Senator Alan Simpson remembered being cornered by Mr. Petzoldt when he was a Wyoming state legislator. He grabbed me by the arm and said, "Simpson, I'm going to talk to you, and you're going to listen," Mr. Simpson recalled. And I said, "That sounds fair enough." Mr. Simpson, who now directs the Institute of Politics at Harvard University, described Mr. Petzoldt as a bear of a man with a big chest and big legs and big arms, and a Falstaffian appetite for life. He didn't suffer fools lightly, but he had time for everybody, Mr. Simpson said. During World War II, Mr. Petzoldt taught safety techniques to the 10th Mountain Division at Camp Hale, Colorado. He also worked in the Department of Agriculture, sending food to Russia. After selling his guide service in 1955, Mr. Petzoldt tried alfalfa farming in Wyoming and soon went broke. In 1963, he joined the Outward Bound program in Colorado as its chief instructor. He left in 1965 to start the National Outdoor Leadership School in Lander, Wyoming. Its mission, he said, was to train leaders capable of conducting all-round wilderness programs in a safe and rewarding manner. Jane Howard later wrote in Life magazine that Petzoldt is to outdoorsmen what Heloise is to housewives, an endless and bountiful source of useful tips and hints. Mr. Petzoldt's Outward Bound successor in Colorado, Jed Williamson, said that Mr. Petzoldt became more outspoken on the environment. As Paul grew in the business of outdoor education, he recognized the need for paying attention to environmental ethics, said Mr. Williamson, who was president of Sterling College and Craftsbury Common, Vermont. More than 50,000 students have graduated from the National Outdoor Leadership School. They include David F. Breishers, who as a 15-year-old could not afford the school but applied anyway. Mr. Petzoldt gave him a scholarship. It was an indicator of his generosity as a person and his love for exposing young people to the outdoors that I got to attend, said Mr. Breishers, who has since climbed Mount Everest 4 times. Until his stamina waned, Mr. Petzoldt tried to spend each New Year's Eve climbing the Grand Teton, packing a bottle of champagne for the summit. Mr. Petzoldt's first 3 marriages ended in divorce. He is survived by his wife, Virginia. Acknowledgements. Although I first heard of Dr. Julian Johnson back in 1973 and knew that he had died in 1939, I never learned the details about how he died or the person who was involved in his killing. For nearly 40 years, even though I had been to India 8 times, all I ever heard about his death was bits and pieces. It was not until about 7 years ago that Mr. Joseph O'Leary, due to his wide reading, came upon books about Paul Petzoldt that explained the peculiar circumstances surrounding Dr. Johnson's death. After Mr. O'Leary posted what he knew on the Radhaswami Studies forum on the internet, there ensued a heated discussion about what he had uncovered and what it all meant. Because of this, I decided to do further research and was fortunate enough to secure copies of important documents related to Johnson's death and the subsequent trial of Paul Petzoldt. I first published some of these raw documents in a special issue of Sachkhand, which was a journal we founded to explore the history of Radhaswami and Sat Mat. Later, I did extensive research at various libraries to dig up more information about the fascinating life of Paul Petzoldt. I was also able to get access to Julian Johnson's more obscure works, both published and unpublished, from the 1930s. I would like to thank the online participants in Radhaswami Studies for prompting me to uncover more information about this much-neglected piece of Sant Mat history. This has been The Mystery of Dr. Johnson's Death, a Spiritual Scandal in the Punjab.